The life of Queen Jeanne of Navarre unfolds in a way that rarely fits the common image of medieval royalty. When you picture a queen from this period, you might imagine a life shaped by courtly ceremony, relentless diplomacy, and open displays of authority. Jeanne certainly experienced these things, yet much of her daily existence was shaped by small personal rituals that she performed away from the political gaze of others. Her interest in herbs, roots, and the softened leaves stored in the wooden chests near her private chambers formed a sort of quiet center around which her life revolved. This interest was not scandalous or celebrated, it was simply present, a restrained fascination that shaped the rhythm of her days. Her childhood gave the earliest hints of this habit. She grew up in an era when the knowledge of plants was both ordinary and essential. Farms, monasteries, and small villages all relied on modest gardens for healing balms, teas, and poultices. The surviving records from Navarre describe small apothecaries in every township. Jenny did not learn this knowledge from books alone. She watched the careful ways of women who worked in the gardens of the palace. These women rarely spoke at length, but their hands communicated enough. They pressed leaves with quiet certainty. They lifted roots from shaded soil. They dried stalks in well-ordered rows above the hearth. Jenny absorbed all of this without any formal training. By the time she reached adolescence, the pressures of noble life required her attention. Court gatherings, family negotiations, and the expectations of alliances pressed on her like a constant weight. In that environment, her visits to the herb rooms became something more than a childhood interest. They became a refuge. You can imagine her slipping into a small corner of the palace, the air heavy with the scent of rosemary and sage. These rooms were rarely visited by the higher ranks of court, unless there was an illness spreading in the corridors. For Jenna, however, they felt steady and predictable. The scent of dried chamomile gave her a sense of grounding. The texture of crushed fennel between her fingers reminded her that the world offered simple physical truths beneath all the layers of ceremony. Her marriage to Philip IV of France shifted her daily life considerably. The French court was larger, more formal, and structured in a way that left less room for unobserved personal habits. Yet even there she maintained her quiet herbal practice. It was not a practice of indulgence or pleasure-seeking in the way you might imagine from the main theme of this series. Her connection to herbs was not an escape from reality through intoxication. Instead, it was a subtle search for stillness. The teas she brewed in her personal chambers were mild, made from plants common across the countryside. She favored gentle blends, the sort meant to calm the spirit rather than alter it. In a court known for its constant movement, this mildness stood out. There is a surviving letter believed to have been written by one of her ladies-in-waiting. It mentions that the queen kept small linen bags of dried leaves in her sleeves. These were not precious or rare, they were simple comforts. She would hold them briefly before meetings and diplomatic conversations. Her attendants did not speak of this in a mocking tone. They described her behavior with a quiet respect, almost as if they understood the significance of such small rituals. In an environment where one wrong phrase could shift an entire alliance, Jenny found balance by grounding herself in something that grew from the soil. Her interest deepened after she began to govern her inherited lands more directly. Navarre had long been known for its rugged landscapes, with mountain valleys that encouraged sturdy plant life. Joanne spent time listening to local healers when she returned to those regions. These healers rarely held official titles. Many were older women who carried knowledge passed through generations. They explained how certain routes eased the strain of long travel. They described how a mild herb placed beneath one's sleeping mat could soothe restless thoughts. Joanne listened with patient curiosity. She did not treat this knowledge as superstition. She saw it as a quiet repository of lived experience. One story tells of a visit to a village where she spoke with a healer who used a plant known for its calming aroma. Jen did not request a demonstration. She simply asked how long the plant had been used in the region. The healer explained that it had remained part of local custom for longer than anyone could remember. Jen valued such continuity. Knowledge that endured across generations offered a kind of stability that the political world could never guarantee. As her responsibilities grew heavier, so did her reliance on these simple routines. The palace records note that she requested more storage space for dried herbs. She also ordered the construction of a better ventilated chamber, where plants could be hung and preserved throughout the seasons. These actions were not extravagant, they were practical in nature. A queen needed a stable environment, and Jenny understood that maintaining her inner composure depended on having these quiet materials close at hand. Her attendants observed that she often walked slowly through her private gardens in the early morning. She rarely touched the plants directly. Instead, she observed them in a patient way that suggested she admired their endurance more than their fragrance. Some scholars later noted that the queen seemed to find comfort in the idea that plants grew steadily regardless of political conflicts. Their unhurried cycles stood in contrast to the decisions that shifted kingdoms. For Jan, observing herbs might have been a way to remember that life offered a pace beyond urgency. Despite her interest, Janny never allowed her herbal habits to interfere with her responsibilities. The chronicles note that she attended councils regularly and managed the affairs of her lands with diligence. Yet, if you look closely at the rhythms of her day, you can see how these small rituals formed an underlying structure. She would drink mild teas before significant negotiations. She kept calming leaves near her writing desk. She frequently visited the storage rooms where fresh bundles were hung. These actions reveal a woman who understood her limits. She recognized that ruling required steadiness. She sought that steadiness in the simplest places. Some might wonder why such a quiet habit deserves attention in the broader picture of medieval history. Yet you must remember that the past is shaped not only by dramatic conflicts and well-known events, but also by the subtle details of daily life. The personal rituals of rulers influenced how they made decisions. Janne's calm demeanor likely affected the way she approached conflict and diplomacy. Her reliance on mild herbs may seem unremarkable, but it reveals a side of medieval royalty that is often overlooked, a side shaped by self-awareness, patience, and the search for balance. As her life progressed, her herbal interests continued without drawing attention from those outside her closest circle. They became a defining element of her identity, though quietly so. Jenny did not speak openly about her habits. She simply carried them with her. Her sense of calm, her measured approach to leadership, and her steady presence in the face of pressure were all connected to these modest routines. When you follow Queen Jan of Navarre further into her life, you begin to see how her herbal habits shaped not only her personal rhythms, but also the subtle dynamics of the court that surrounded her. What appeared outwardly as a simple preference for mild teas and calming leaves gradually became a quiet method for navigating the demands of leadership. You can imagine her moving through the halls of the palace, poised and attentive, carrying an inner stillness that contrasted with the restless atmosphere of the French court. This sense of quiet strength did not appear overnight. It developed slowly as she adapted her early fascination with herbs into a consistent practice. Her role as queen consort, and later as a ruler with her own sovereign authority, placed her under constant scrutiny. Yet those who observed her closely often commented on her measured tone and steady presence. In a court where tempers could rise quickly and alliances shifted in sudden, unpredictable ways, Jane stood out for her ability to remain composed. That composure, shaped by years of small herbal routines, influenced the confidence others placed in her. Even though many courtiers did not know the full extent of her habits, they sensed that she possessed a quiet steadiness that came from somewhere beyond the expected education of a medieval noblewoman. The people closest to her noticed how she incorporated herbs into her daily responsibilities in ways that did not disrupt her duties. For instance, she encouraged the servants charged with maintaining the palace gardens to keep careful records of seasonal growth patterns. While this may seem like a simple request, it reflects her desire to understand the natural cycles that influence the availability of certain calming plants. This knowledge gave her more than personal reassurance. It also supported the palace's broader inventory of medicinal supplies. Many of these herbs were used for treating headaches, fevers, and sleeplessness among the staff and noble families residing in the palace. Jane's interest, though personal, contributed indirectly to the well-being of those around her. There is a record of one particular season when drought threatened the gardens near Paris. The soil hardened under the heat, and the gardeners struggled to keep the herb beds alive. Janny visited them often during this period, not with commands but with questions. She wanted to know how long the drought had lasted in previous years, which plants were most resistant to the dry winds, and how they could preserve the most fragile varieties. Her presence encouraged the gardeners, who were often overlooked by the upper ranks of court. They felt seen and valued, and they responded by working with careful attention to preserve as much of the garden as possible. Her quiet involvement revealed the type of ruler she was becoming, one who understood that large decisions often depended on the smallest pieces of knowledge. Her herbal habits also influenced the manner in which she communicated with diplomats and foreign visitors. Jane preferred to hold discussions in rooms where the air felt clean and mild, often scented with stored leaves or dried flowers. These scents were not overpowering, nor did they carry any intoxicating effects. Instead, they created a sense of ease that allowed conversations to unfold at a measured pace. Visitors often remarked that speaking with her felt unhurried, even when the topics were tense. Jane seemed to understand that calm surroundings encouraged open dialogue. In this way, her personal rituals subtly shaped political outcomes. Some documents indicate that she sought knowledge from medical practitioners who traveled across Europe. She did not pursue the more dramatic concoctions favored by certain nobles of her era. Those were often mixtures prepared for bold sensations or ambitious cures. Instead, she asked for information about plants known for their steadying qualities. One physician noted that the queen seemed uninterested in anything that clouded the mind. She preferred clarity and balance. This distinction sets her apart from many of the royals whose stories will appear later in this collection. Where others leaned toward indulgence or escape, Jenny sought a grounded calm that helped her focus on governance. Her interest in herbs appeared again in the way she organized her household. She encouraged her attendants to learn the basics of plant preservation. While it was common for noble households to maintain small stores of herbs, Shani fostered an environment where this knowledge became part of daily life. She did not force her attendants to adopt her habits, yet many of them grew comfortable brewing mild teas or preparing small bundles for winter storage. This created a household atmosphere that felt gentler than that of many courts in France. Visitors sometimes found it unusual, yet they described the queen's living quarters as peaceful, even in moments when political tensions were high. Her relationship with her homeland played a significant part in shaping these habits. Navarre's climate, varied across mountain and valley, produced hardy plants known for endurance rather than fragility. When Jem traveled between France and her inherited lands, she carried small quantities of dried herbs as reminders of home. These were not exotic materials. They were simple plants that grew in abundance across the region. Some accounts suggest that she asked the gardeners in France to cultivate certain varieties she had grown familiar with in Navarre. Over time, these plants appeared in the palace gardens, though they never reached the prominence of more decorative flowers favored by the nobility. They grew quietly, much like Jen's practices themselves. Her interest in herbs also offered a small window into her view of leadership. She believed that a ruler must be steady to make sound decisions. Emotional balance mattered, and Jenny worked to maintain it. She understood her own temperament well enough to recognize when she needed a moment of stillness. Rather than retreating from her responsibilities, she used these calm herbs to regain focus. This self-awareness, rare among rulers of any era, allowed her to manage the pressures of leadership with more stability than many of her contemporaries. Letters exchanged between her and trusted advisors reveal how she approached difficult matters. She often asked for detailed information before making a decision. Her questions showed a preference for clarity rather than impulsive judgment. It is possible that her herbal routines played a role in shaping this approach. When she sat with a cup of mild tea or held a small bundle of calming leaves, she gave herself the space to think slowly. This slow thinking, deliberate, patient and measured, became a defining feature of her leadership. Her children, too, grew accustomed to the presence of herbs in their mother's chambers. They occasionally mentioned the scents that drifted through the rooms, the softened notes of dried lavender, the subtle earthiness of crushed mint. These scents formed a backdrop to their early lives. While their education prepared them for political roles, the atmosphere created by their mother offered a different sort of foundation, one rooted in steadiness and gentle routines. As Jane aged, her herbal practice did not fade. Instead, it became more refined. She experimented with new drying methods to preserve plants for longer periods. She consulted with healers from various regions to compare techniques. She collected small notes that documented how certain plants behaved when stored under different conditions. These quiet observations formed a type of knowledge that rarely appears in official chronicles, yet they show a ruler who paid attention to details often considered unimportant by those around her. Her reputation for calmness spread across her lands. In times of tension, people looked to her for guidance. They trusted her because she did not react impulsively. Her decisions were thoughtful. She understood how to weigh consequences. And behind this measured leadership stood the steady rhythm of her herbal routines, grounding her day after day. But one lingering question remains. If these herbs offered Jian such balance and quiet strength, did others ever seek to imitate her habits? And did her calmness ever conceal deeper burdens that she did not share openly with those around her? When you move into the final period of Queen Jian of Navarre's life, you begin to notice how her herbal routines transformed from a quiet personal refuge into a steady companion that shaped her final years. Her practices did not change in dramatic ways. Instead, they deepened. The small gestures she had carried with her since childhood, became the framework by which she managed both her private worries and the larger pressures of ruling lands divided by culture, landscape, and expectation. The closer you observe her days, the more you see how her lifelong fascination became a silent thread woven through every stage of her leadership. Her responsibilities as queen were never light. She governed Navarre, raised children expected to influence the future of France, and managed the complexities of French political life. These obligations grew more demanding, with age, not less. Yet, despite the weight placed upon her, those who met her during her later years consistently described a woman who remained calm even when surrounded by tension. You have already seen how her early herbal habits supported this sense of inner balance. But by this point in her life, the practice had become something much more like a daily discipline, one that helped her navigate the accumulated memories, pressures, and disappointments that accompany long leadership. Her chambers in Paris changed subtly through the years. Workers expanded the storage shelves where dried leaves and roots were kept. The gentle scents that once drifted quietly through her private rooms became part of their character, familiar to any visitor allowed inside. These spaces were not elaborate. They were simple, warm, and orderly. Gianni preferred calm lighting and minimal decoration. She kept woven baskets of dried leaves near her writing desk and arranged small pouches in a drawer close to where she held private meetings. Her attendants noted that she often prepared her own small teas in the afternoons, rather than asking others to do it for her. This was not a show of independence. It was a way for her to maintain a steady rhythm in a world that rarely offered certainty. Her reputation for steadiness fostered trust among advisors. When difficult matters arose, people sought her counsel because she was known to consider problems with patience. She did not rush to judgment. Instead, she worked through issues with deliberate thoughtfulness. This attitude became especially valuable during periods when relations between France and Navarre grew strained. Jane understood both lands intimately, and she recognized that misunderstandings often grew from impatience. Her calm approach helped mediate tensions that might otherwise have escalated. Even as her herbal habits became more rooted, Gianni's interest in the knowledge behind them matured. She corresponded with monastic gardeners, village healers, and traveling physicians, gathering notes not for public display but for her personal understanding. These individuals wrote to her about seasonal shifts in plant growth, drying methods that preserved leaves through long winters, and observations about how certain herbs behaved when prepared in different ways. She responded with genuine curiosity, requesting clarifications or asking about the origins of certain practices. Over time, her small collection of notes grew into an informal archive. It was never intended to be a great work of scholarship, yet it captured the lived experiences of people across her lands, each offering a glimpse into the quiet world of everyday healing. Her aging years brought physical challenges, as they do for any person. The chronicles do not describe dramatic illness, but they mention fatigue, long council hours, and the strain of travel between her lands. She responded in her characteristic way with calm endurance and steady habits. She favored teas that soothed the body after long days, using herbs known for their gentle warming qualities. These plants could not erase the burdens of rule, but they allowed her to approach her responsibilities with the degree of clarity she valued. Her attendants often remarked that even when she felt unwell, she maintained a composed presence, as if her herbal routines were the anchor that allowed her to keep moving. The growing tensions of the French court also required careful navigation. The royal household contained many voices, each seeking influence. Jen understood the currents beneath these interactions. She spoke little in public settings, but observed men and women keenly, recognizing that many conflicts in court rose not from malicious intent, but from impatience and pride. Her patience, strengthened by years of calm routines, enabled her to manage these dynamics quietly. She preferred subtle influence, guiding conversations, easing tensions, and offering perspectives that helped others reconsider their positions. Her quiet methods were often more effective than the forceful displays favored by some nobles. As her children matured, they became more aware of the habits that shaped their mother's life. They saw the teas she prepared, the small bundles stored near her desk, and the gentle scents that filled her rooms. They understood that these rituals were not signs of frailty or indulgence, but part of her strength. Some sources suggest that her daughters adopted mild versions of her practices, not out of imitation, but because they saw the steadiness these habits provided. Her sons, too, respected her need for quiet moments, recognizing that leadership required time to gather one's thoughts. Her relationship with Navarre remained central to her identity, even as she lived much of her life at the French court. Whenever she traveled through her homeland, she visited the gardens and healers who had shaped her early knowledge. These were not grand royal tours. They were small, intentional visits that reaffirmed her connection to the landscapes she ruled. She spoke with older women who tended remote gardens and listened to their memories of seasonal cycles that stretched back through generations. These conversations grounded her, reminding her that leadership was not only about treaties and councils, but about understanding the quiet rhythms that governed the lives of ordinary people. The final years of her life show how deeply her herbal practice had become intertwined with her inner world. Her attendants noted that she spent more time in the early hours of the morning, observing her private gardens, moving slowly among the plants before the palace fully awakened. She touched the leaves more often than she had in her youth, running her fingers gently along the edges, as though acknowledging the years of quiet companionship they had provided. The gardens were not large, yet they offered her a sense of continuity that political life could never match. When illness finally began to take hold, and her strength waned, her routines remained steady. She continued to keep small sachets near her bedside, and asked her attendants to prepare mild teas even when she could drink only a few sips. These small gestures rooted her in familiarity during a time when the body becomes unpredictable. The historical accounts do not describe dramatic last days. Instead, they describe quiet rooms, steady breaths, and attendants who moved gently, respecting the lifelong habits of the queen they served. After her death, her herbal notes and pouches were not preserved as relics. They were simple objects that returned to the quiet corners from which they had come. Yet the memory of her calm endurance lingered. Chroniclers remembered her as steady, thoughtful, and patient. These traits shaped her legacy far more than any grand gesture might have. Her life demonstrates how small, consistent routines can influence the course of history, not through dramatic displays but through the quiet shaping of character. Now that you have walked through the full span of Jian's life, you might wonder how much of her resilience can be traced back to those early days in the herb rooms, watching the careful hands of palace gardeners. You might also ask yourself how many other leaders across history relied on similarly quiet rituals that never made their way into official chronicles. And perhaps the unanswered question that lingers most is this: if her calm presence shaped her lands so gently, what might have happened if more rulers had allowed such simple habits to guide their decisions? When you step into the world of Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy, you find yourself surrounded by an atmosphere shaped not by sudden extravagance, but by a slow, steady rhythm of indulgence that defined much of his daily life. This indulgence was not the dramatic type that storytellers like to exaggerate. Instead, it was built upon a continuous familiarity with wine, aromatic rooms, and the gentle comfort of shared drink. Philip did not seek altered states through strange concoctions or startling substances. Instead, he lived in a court where wine flowed in a quiet, almost predictable current, touching everything from private meals to political ceremonies. To understand him, you must first understand how deeply this mild intoxication shaped the culture he created. His duchy in the early and middle 15th century was one of the most powerful in Western Europe, spanning lands from the Low Countries to the heart of Burgundy. It formed a wide corridor of wealth, trade, and influence. Within this domain, Philip cultivated a court known for refinement. Many remember him for his patronage of the arts, for the glittering feasts he hosted, and for the elaborate systems of ceremony he developed. Yet, beneath these decorations lay a more ordinary truth. Daily life in his palace revolved around wine, not in the way of reckless consumption, but as a constant companion that softened the sharp corners of political life. If you picture the Duke at the start of an ordinary morning, you must imagine rooms filled, not with noise, but with the scent of wooden casks. Servants moved through the corridors, carrying narrow jugs. These were not packed for special occasions. They were part of the daily routine. The vineyards across Burgundy produced wine that was prized for its steady flavor, and each estate under the Duke's control contributed to the vast stores that supplied his household. Wine was considered safer to drink than many sources of water. It was also woven into the fabric of hospitality. To offer wine was to offer respect, welcome, and peace. This meant that Philip was rarely far from a cup. The records left by chroniclers describe him as a man who preferred steady familiarity over sharp excess. He drank often, but with a slow and measured cadence. You may imagine him seated at a long table in the early afternoon, listening to reports from advisors while taking small sips from a cup fashioned by a local craftsman. The wine warmed him slightly, offering a sense of ease that helped him navigate both mundane decisions and matters of heavy consequence. It was not unusual for political meetings to extend late into the evening, and the presence of wine allowed discussions to flow with a softness that Philip valued. This softening became a defining feature of his leadership. His duchy stretched across regions with different customs and languages, yet he managed to maintain unity through patient negotiation rather than sudden declarations. One reason for this patience may lie in the environment he cultivated. Wine was not simply a drink. It was part of the pace at which conversations unfolded. Servants refilled cups quietly. Advisors spoke in measured tones. Visitors from distant cities approached discussions with a sense that they were part of a shared ritual rather than a sharp confrontation. Wine provided a slow rhythm, and Philip followed it. He understood that diplomacy required endurance. Burgundy's position meant constant contact with England, France, the Low Countries, and various small states that bordered his lands. Some conversations lasted many hours. Others stretched across several days. Chroniclers noted that Philip seemed most comfortable when he could listen at length, allowing arguments to rise and settle. The steady presence of wine helped create an atmosphere where each participant felt grounded enough to speak openly. It did not lead to recklessness. Instead, it created a mild, consistent calm that allowed him to maintain focus even as discussions grew complicated. This rhythm extended to his evenings. The court of Burgundy was famous for its banquets. People often imagine these events as dazzling spectacles, but they were also long and repetitive affairs. The meals included many courses prepared from local produce, but the most constant element was the wine. It accompanied every part of the feast, from the first simple course to the final serving of fruit. The Duke attended these gatherings not just for pleasure, but because they were tools of political unity. A shared drink created a shared moment, and Philip was skilled at using these moments to reinforce bonds with powerful families. It is important to note that wine played a central role, not because it created dramatic intoxication, but because it offered a mild comfort that eased the strain of formality. Philip's courtiers understood this well. They drank in slow and steady patterns. The goal was not to reach extreme states, but to maintain an agreeable warmth that allowed conversation to linger. In many ways, this mirrored the Duke's own temperament. He was not known for sudden bursts of energy or dramatic displays. He preferred steadiness, and wine supported that steadiness. The structure of his court added to this atmosphere. Philip reorganized the ceremonies, councils, and duties of his nobles with exceptional attention to detail. He expected regular attendance at meetings, and he created new orders of chivalry that gathered loyal nobles around him. His most famous creation, the Order of the Golden Fleece, brought together knights from across his territories. At their gatherings, wine played a symbolic role as well as a practical one. To drink together was to affirm loyalty. To refill a neighbor's cup was to acknowledge shared purpose. The Duke presided over these gatherings with a calm confidence, holding his cup as he listened to oaths and speeches. Wine became part of the identity of his court. If you walked through the halls of his palace late in the day, long after the banquets had ended, you might find servants cleaning the tables while the scent of the last opened casks lingered in the air. The Duke's household was vast, and its daily operations required constant movement. Yet the presence of wine continued even in these quieter hours. Small cups were kept near the servants' workstations, offering warmth during cold nights. Visitors housed in guest rooms received modest jugs as a gesture of hospitality. The palace itself seemed designed to sustain a gentle current of mild intoxication that softened the challenges of its size and activity. This steady pattern extended beyond Philip's immediate household. The cities under his control benefited from the trade that wine encouraged. Merchants relied on Burgundy's reputation for quality. Taverns and inns across his lands shaped their local cultures around the drinks produced in the vineyards. Farmers depended on the Duke for protection of their fields, while he depended on them for the harvests that sustained his court. This mutual reliance deepened the connection between ruler and people. Wine in this context was not simply a comfort but a shared resource that strengthened the prosperity of the duchy. Philip himself took a personal interest in the vineyards. He visited them during long travels across his territories, asking questions about soil conditions, rainfall patterns, and local methods of cultivation. His interest was practical, as well as personal. The more he understood the land, the better he could secure its economic stability. Chroniclers describe moments when he stood among rows of vines, speaking with growers about their challenges. These conversations rarely appear in grand histories, yet they reveal a ruler who recognized the quiet foundation underlying his court's refined atmosphere. The Duke's affinity for drink also shaped his private life. In moments away from the pressures of leadership, he enjoyed quiet gatherings with trusted companions. These were not elaborate feasts, but simple evenings with a modest amount of wine and unhurried conversation. Those who attended these gatherings noted that he seemed most at ease during such moments. The warm comfort of the drink, combined with the steady company of familiar faces, allowed him to think without the weight of ceremony pressing upon him. By the time he reached his later years, this pattern of steady indulgence had become so woven into the rhythm of his life that it is difficult to imagine him without it. Wine was present in celebrations, negotiations, quiet evenings, and public duties. It shaped his interactions and softened the world around him. It was not an escape but a companion, one that influenced the tone of his leadership and the character of his court. Yet, as you watch his life settle into this familiar pattern, you may begin to wonder about a tension that is not always spoken aloud. If wine offered comfort, did it also blur certain responsibilities or slow certain decisions? And could the steady rhythm that shaped his court have hidden deeper strains beneath its warm surface? You continue wandering through the long and unhurried corridors of late medieval France, tracing the life of Charles VI not through the thunder of battles or the proclamations of kingship, but through the quiet details that made up his days. You may expect the reign of a monarch to be filled with spectacle, yet in truth, the world around Charles was mostly shaped by slow-moving patterns that rarely changed, no matter how troubled his own mind became. Understanding these background rhythms allows you to see how his moments of clarity and his moments of confusion rippled outward with surprising force, even when nothing dramatic seemed to be happening. Life in the royal household itself followed dependable routines that had existed for generations. Every morning began with the ritual known simply as the King's Rising. It was not a private gesture. It was a performance attended by servants, nobles, and officials of the household. Some held basins of water, others held garments. Still others observed with the quiet seriousness that such duties demanded. Even a king who feared his own reflection or believed he was made of fragile material could not easily escape these procedures. The court expected continuity. The rituals were older than the people performing them, built on the belief that order could be preserved through repetition. As Charles declined into deeper episodes of illness, these routines took on an even more important function. They were meant to hold the shape of the monarchy together, even when the king himself could not always inhabit that shape. You can imagine the chamber on a cold morning. The shutters barely hold back the damp breeze. The fire has been tended for hours already. The attendants wait, uncertain whether they will greet a lucid monarch or one who refuses to speak to them at all. On some mornings, Charles would rise and acknowledge them with a gentle, almost apologetic nod. On others he stared past them, convinced that he was no longer safe in his own skin. Outside the personal chambers, the palace functioned with calculated order. There were keepers of keys, masters of stables, stewards responsible for food stores, and clerks who recorded even the smallest financial transaction. The court was a place of movement. Scribes walked between rooms with folded documents. Messengers entered and exited with steady pace. Even the kitchens, which you may imagine as noisy and chaotic, had a precise rhythm. There were specific hours for roasting meat, for grinding grain, for preparing broths, and for organizing the tables where meals for hundreds of people would be set out. This order, however, did not settle the unrest that slowly formed around the royal family. When the king suffered another mental collapse, the routines continued outwardly, yet internally, many of the leading nobles began planning how they might guide the kingdom, or profit from the king's weakened state, or steer policy toward their own interests. The royal uncles, especially the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans, saw every episode as an opportunity. They did not always act with hostility, but they also did not act with patience. The crown was a source of resources and influence, and the one who controlled the king's decisions controlled much more than ceremonial authority. Even so, for long stretches you would find nothing dramatic if you wandered through the palace grounds. You would see workers repairing tiles on the roof. You might hear the ring of a hammer from the smithy where horseshoes were being shaped and reshaped. You could pass by clerics in conversation about the arrangement of the next royal procession. Despite the disorder rising at the highest levels of politics, the daily life of most people connected to the court stayed predictable. Many of them did not think in terms of national governance. They thought about keeping their employment, receiving their wages, and avoiding conflict with their superiors. Outside the palace walls, the townspeople of Paris also lived according to familiar routines. Artisans worked slowly and methodically. Bakers rose before sunrise. Cloth workers labored in small rooms filled with the steady sound of looms. Street vendors positioned their carts in similar spots day after day. Most citizens heard reports of the king's instability only as passing rumors, and even those who believed the stories had little power to influence the direction of the kingdom. For many of them, what mattered more was the price of grain or the next tax that might be levied on their goods. Still, the mood of the city sometimes shifted when the king emerged during his stable periods. When Charles appeared at public ceremonies, he was gentle in demeanor, soft-spoken, and often kind in ways that surprised those who expected a hardened ruler. He granted pardons. He listened carefully to petitions. He could hold lengthy conversations about building projects, legal disputes, or the upkeep of certain roads. During these windows of clarity, the city breathed more easily. You can imagine how reassuring it must have been to witness the return of steadiness, even if only for a short time. The simplicity of these intervals makes them all the more striking. As long as Charles appeared in public, even briefly, the machinery of administration returned to something resembling normal operation. Orders were signed. Councils met with renewed urgency. Diplomats visited with more confidence. For a moment the swirling uncertainty quieted. Yet the illness always returned, and when it did, the nobles resumed their slow contest for influence. The Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, tended to favor lavish spending, cultural projects and alliances that expanded his own reach. The Duke of Burgundy leaned towards stricter financial control and political dominance. These differences may not sound dramatic, yet within the structure of a medieval monarchy they shaped the entire atmosphere of decision-making. Choices about taxation, military campaigns, and appointments to important positions all depended on which faction held the king's ear during a period of clarity. It is easy to think of political conflict as loud and violent, yet much of the competition unfolded through small gestures. A servant receiving instructions from one duke instead of the other, a clerk delaying a document by a day in order to influence which council members signed it, a messenger changing the phrasing of a letter slightly to affect how a command was interpreted. These tiny actions, repeated again and again, slowly shifted the balance of power during the years of the king's instability. The people, closest to Charles, watched this with growing unease. Some believed the king could be protected through careful management of his surroundings. They sought to limit noise, reduce stress, and create a sense of calm in his chambers. Others believed that strict spiritual discipline was necessary, urging prayer, fasting, and ritual cleansing. Physicians introduced treatments based on humoral theory, adjusting his diet or prescribing rest, yet nothing produced lasting improvement. Despite this, Charles still experienced moments when he felt tethered to reality again. During one of these periods he ordered the government to reduce certain taxes, hoping to relieve pressure on the common people. At another time he devoted attention to repairing damaged city walls and improving internal communication between officials. These actions may appear minor, but they offered a glimpse of what the kingdom might have been if the stability had endured. The Queen, Isabella of Bavaria, navigated these shifting currents of influence with caution. She built her own alliances and monitored the behavior of the leading nobles with quiet attention. Some accounts portray her as manipulative, yet others suggest she simply understood the fragility of the royal household and acted to protect herself and her children. Her position was not one of luxury but of constant vigilance, for a change in favor could alter her standing overnight. Meanwhile, the dukes intensified their competition. Each acquired supporters among the Parisian elites and regional nobles. They developed networks that stretched across trade guilds, ecclesiastical offices, and military forces, and all of this political movement occurred within the slow, steady rhythm of daily medieval life, where candles were still dipped by hand, parchment still scraped smooth for writing, and the ringing of cathedral bells still marked the passing of hours. You can almost imagine how strange it must have felt to live in such a world, where the steady pace of ordinary work continued, even as the highest level of leadership weakened. A scribe might record the king's orders in the morning, and then overhear whispered doubts about the king's sanity by afternoon. A baker might prepare bread for both rival factions without fully grasping the tensions that ran between them. A stable worker might tend the same horses year after year while the kingdom slid gradually into internal division. Amid all of this, Charles himself remained the quiet center around which every uncertainty revolved. His struggles were not only personal but structural. The medieval monarchy depended heavily on the physical and mental presence of the king. When he was unwell, the entire foundation of governance trembled, yet the tremors were slow, subtle, and often masked by the predictable routines that kept the palace functioning. As Section 2 draws to a close, you may find yourself wondering how long such a delicate arrangement could hold. How long could the kingdom continue balancing daily normalcy against the unpredictable instability of its ruler? And how far would the rivalry between the leading nobles go once the king's condition worsened beyond what ordinary routines could conceal? You return once more to the world surrounding Charles VI, a world that had grown accustomed to uncertainty, delays, and the slow drifting of authority from one pair of hands to another. By the later years of his reign, the quiet tension that had hovered around the palace finally began to shape the direction of the entire kingdom. It was not a sudden collapse. Instead, it unfolded as a gradual weakening, like a tapestry left too long in the sun, its threads loosening one by one until the pattern began to sag. You may imagine that political downfall arrives with dramatic scenes. Yet in truth, most of the kingdom's unraveling began in small choices made during the king's prolonged absences of mind. When he fell into one of his withdrawn states, the court adjusted instantly. Rooms once filled with murmured consultation grew strangely subdued. Attendants spoke in lower tones. Servants exchanged glances before carrying messages from one chamber to another. Even the candles seemed to burn more softly, as though the very air sensed the shift. During these long spells of illness, power leaned heavily toward whichever faction had stationed more trusted officers near the king's rooms. The Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans became the two competing poles of influence. Their disagreements multiplied in slow, steady waves. At first, the conflict was merely a difference in approach. One favored careful financial order, the other favored expansive spending and alliances. But as time passed and the king's health continued to waver, the rivalry deepened. Each side began to see the other not merely as an inconvenience, but as an obstacle to the stability of the realm. Meanwhile, the ordinary business of the kingdom continued in its patient rhythm. Tax collectors recorded their tallies. Local officials sent petitions to the capital. Rural communities submitted reports on grain production, water rights, and border disputes with neighboring estates. These routine matters seldom reached the king directly, but his signature was still needed to maintain legal continuity. When he was lucid, he signed documents with a steady hand. When he was lost in confusion, the nobles quietly handled such matters without him, leaving the illusion that royal will still guided the machinery of government. Within the palace walls, the atmosphere shifted from unease to quiet vigilance. The Queen, Isabella of Bavaria, found herself at the center of sets of political threads she had not fully chosen but could no longer escape. She monitored each whisper in the hall, each letter delivered at odd hours, each unexpected visit by a noble seeking an audience. Her position depended heavily on maintaining a sense of balance. Should she lean too far toward either faction, she risked isolation, yet remaining neutral invited suspicion from both sides. Her daily life became a careful exercise in appearing composed even when the ground beneath her felt unsteady. Beyond the palace, the people of Paris continued their ordinary routines. You may picture the narrow streets, the wooden buildings leaning toward one another, the stone bridges lined with vendors, and the slow turning of mill wheels along the river. Most citizens did not know the exact state of the king's mind, yet they sensed the consequences. Prices shifted unpredictably. Trade regulations changed with little warning. Collections of dues became stricter. At times the mood of the city grew tense, fed by rumors that drifted from taverns near the palace walls. Amid this evolving uncertainty, another force began to rise. Resentment between the supporters of the rival factions. It did not begin with open hostility. It grew through gossip, accusations, and silent disapproval exchanged in corridors. One household might align itself with Burgundy because of past favors. Another might favor Orleans because of shared economic interests. Shopkeepers overheard political arguments while serving customers. Clerks noticed changes in tone when delivering messages. Even small gestures, like a noble arriving at a feast wearing a particular color or emblem, could signal alignment that others quickly interpreted. What makes this period so striking is how gently the kingdom drifted toward deeper instability. There were no sudden triggers, only a series of small pressures that slowly pushed the political structure toward imbalance. Every time the king disappeared into an episode of confused fear or quiet withdrawal, the nobles pressed harder to secure advantage. Every moment of clarity brought temporary calm, but also the dread of knowing another spell might arrive without warning. During one of these clearer intervals, Charles attempted to reconcile the competing factions by urging cooperation between the leading nobles. His intentions were sincere. He hoped to preserve unity and protect the kingdom from internal discord. But although his words carried royal authority, his diminished strength made it difficult for anyone to believe that lasting order could be achieved. The nobles listened, nodded respectfully, and returned to their quiet strategies as soon as he withdrew to rest. Across the wider landscape of France, Regional leaders grew uncertain about whom to follow. Some aligned with Burgundy, trusting his reputation for practicality and administrative order. Others supported Orleans, drawn by his cultural patronage and vision for a more expansive role on the international stage. The kingdom that had once depended on the firm presence of the monarch now depended on shifting alliances held together by fragile agreements and unspoken expectations. In the palace, even the servants began to feel the strain. Their lives depended on the stability of the court. The cooks continued preparing meals according to the old schedules. The stable workers cared for the royal horses with the same attention they always had. The scribes wrote with controlled strokes, preserving the appearance of order. Yet beneath this surface, the daily conversations grew more cautious. An incautious remark in front of a supporter of the wrong faction could jeopardize a livelihood. The king's personal experience during these years was a mixture of brief clarity and long stretches of confusion. During his lucid periods, he seemed to sense the growing weight placed on him, though he could not fully reverse it. He often spoke gently to those around him, apologizing for burdens he believed he had caused. He worried about the future of his children. He worried about the well-being of the kingdom. And yet he could not escape the episodes that returned with quiet insistence, pulling him away from the familiar world into a place where he felt both fragile and unseen. Eventually, the rivalry between the major factions escalated in ways that could no longer be contained within the palace. Accusations sharpened. Retinues grew larger. Tensions spilled into the streets, where supporters of one faction sometimes confronted supporters of the other. These confrontations were usually brief and scattered, but they signaled a deepening divide. The kingdom had entered a period where ordinary disagreements could quickly be interpreted as political declarations. Still, you must imagine this not as a scene of continuous chaos, but as one of slow progressing strain. Daily routines continued almost unchanged for long stretches. Farmers still tended their fields. Merchants still moved between market towns. Clerics still performed the rituals that marked the turning of the seasons. Yet all the while, a quiet sense of fragility crept deeper into the consciousness of those who paid close attention. It was the sense that the kingdom stood on a foundation that no longer felt entirely solid. As the years advanced, the consequences of Charles's illness became impossible to overlook. The nobles no longer competed simply for influence. They competed for control of the very direction of the realm. Each believed his vision represented the best path forward. Each viewed the other not merely as a rival, but as a threat to the stability of France. And the king, the one figure who could have unified these forces, was often absent in mind even when physically present. By the time the tension reached its highest point, the kingdom had already begun sliding toward the larger conflict that historians would later connect to the wider struggles of the age. What had started as a private illness had grown into a force shaping the political destiny of an entire realm. A king's fragile mind had become the center of a national fracture. As you reach the end of this story, you may reflect on how quietly history can shift. There is no single moment when the course of France changed. Instead, it was shaped by daily routines, small decisions, quiet rivalries, and the unpredictable rhythm of a single man's illness. You might ask yourself, how different the realm might have been if the king had remained healthy. Would the rivalries have softened? Would the nobles have chosen cooperation over competition? Or was the kingdom already moving toward division long before the illness took hold? And so you are left with a final thought. How many turning points in history begin, not with dramatic battles or heroic declarations, but with quiet, unremarkable moments in the private life of someone who never intended to change the world at all? You step now into another corner of medieval Europe. Far from the crowded streets of Paris and the unstable reign of Charles VI, your journey brings you eastward into the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, where a very different kind of royal figure drifted through life with a slow and hazy serenity. His name was Frederick IV, Duke of Austria, who reigned in the earlier decades of the 15th century. His court, unlike those of more commanding rulers, became known for its languid atmosphere, its willingness to indulge in distraction, and its unusual tolerance for the intoxicating plants that grew in the alpine valleys. The world around Frederick did not resemble the grand, centralized monarchies of France or England. Power in the empire was distributed across many small jurisdictions, each governed by a noble who controlled his own lands, his own retainers, and his own limited authority. Frederick ruled over the Tyrol, a region defined by steep mountains, narrow passes, and villages that clung stubbornly to the sides of cliffs. His responsibilities included managing trade routes that wound through dangerous valleys, regulating tolls that kept his treasury stable, and mediating disputes among local families who had been arguing with one another for generations. But Frederick himself was not a man drawn to the strict details of governance. From his youth he had shown a preference for quiet retreats, long hours spent alone or with only a few trusted companions, and a certain fascination with rare herbs and the soothing effects they offered. Some claimed he first learned of these plants from healers in the mountain villages, who used them to calm fevers and quiet troubled minds. Others believed he discovered them in the exotic goods that passed along the trade routes, brought by merchants who carried bundles of dried leaves and roots from distant lands. Whatever the origin, Frederick's interest deepened as he grew older. His contemporaries often remarked that his presence seemed softer than that of other nobles. He walked more slowly, spoke more gently, and preferred to observe rather than command. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely displayed anger. This calm, while at times admirable, frustrated those who served under him, for decisions that required urgency often arrived at a pace too slow for their liking. What you must remember is that medieval life did not move quickly by modern standards. Communication was slow. Roads were dangerous. Messages could take days or weeks to arrive, and yet, even by these relaxed rhythms, Frederick's manner seemed unusually unhurried. At times he would interrupt a discussion of trade tariffs or territorial boundaries to ask about the cultivation of certain herbs in higher elevations. On other occasions, he delayed meetings with envoys because he wished to sit quietly in his private garden, surrounded by plants whose names were familiar only to mountain healers and wandering herbalists. His court adapted to his habits in ways that blended practicality with resignation. The stewards learned to schedule more time than necessary for consultations. Advisors learned to phrase their counsel carefully, for Frederick disliked confrontation and preferred suggestions to demands. Scribal clerks learned to wait patiently, while he considered each phrase in documents requiring his approval, sometimes pausing to gaze out a window or sip a warm brew made from leaves that gave off a faintly sweet fragrance. It is tempting to think of Frederick as careless, but that would be inaccurate. He cared very much about his lands. He cared about the difficulties of his subjects, the importance of trade, and the maintenance of peace. But his approach came through a quiet filter. He believed in steadying himself before making any decision, and while this practice brought him a sense of inner ease, it also meant that he moved through the world at a pace that sometimes placed him at odds with the demands of leadership. You can picture his residence, a sturdy castle built on a high outcrop, overlooking long winding roads below. The walls were thick. The rooms were dim, lit by torches or narrow windows carved into stone. Outside the castle gate, pine forests stretched quietly across the mountainsides. These forests held plants that Frederick found particularly intriguing. He sent trusted gatherers into the woods each season to collect what he described as calming herbs. They returned with sacks of leaves and stems which were dried carefully and stored in wooden chests lined with cloth. His interest in these herbs eventually shaped the atmosphere of the entire court. Even those who did not share his preference for their effects became accustomed to their presence. The air inside the private chambers often carried a gentle, earthy scent. Servants preparing his daily drink moved with steady precision, mixing herbs in specific proportions. Physicians, recognizing the Duke's inclination, sometimes suggested mild infusions to ease tension or settle restless thoughts. Over time, what might have seemed unusual in another court became routine within Frederick's household. Yet the quiet ease that surrounded Frederick did not extend evenly across his territories. His lands mattered greatly to the larger political structure of the empire, for the Tyrol controlled important mountain crossings used by merchants traveling between northern and southern Europe. These routes generated tolls that enriched Frederick's coffers, but they also attracted interest from neighboring nobles who wished to gain influence over them. A ruler who acted slowly risked losing ground to those who acted more quickly. When envoys from neighboring territories visited Frederick, they sometimes left with mixed impressions. They admired his calm, his courtesy, and his willingness to listen. But they also sensed a certain softness in his resolve. They wondered how far they could push him. They wondered whether his attention could be diverted, or whether his pleasant disposition masked a firmer core they had yet to see. Some attempted to test him with unfavorable trade proposals. Others tried to extract concessions through subtle threats. But Frederick, despite his gentle nature, was not entirely incapable of firm decisions. What he lacked was not intelligence but urgency. At court, Many of his advisors struggled quietly with their growing concerns. They respected their duke and appreciated his kindness, but they also recognized that the pressures surrounding their region continued to grow. Merchants petitioned for better protection along the mountain roads. Miners asked for adjustments to taxation on extracted metals. Lords from neighboring lands made inquiries about treaties and border agreements. Some matters required swift replies that Frederick was reluctant to give. One of his closest counselors, a man named Ulrich, tried repeatedly to urge more decisive action. Ulrich was patient, but he understood the risks of hesitation. He often sat beside Frederick in the duke's private chamber, presenting matters clearly and calmly, yet even he found it difficult to overcome Frederick's tendency to drift into contemplation. Their conversations rarely became heated, but they also rarely led to firm conclusions. Beyond the castle walls, life continued at a slow but steady pace. Villagers tended livestock, gathered wood for winter, and maintained the terraces carved into the mountainsides. They heard stories about their duke's gentle nature and his fondness for calming herbs, though few understood the extent of his interest. What mattered more to them was whether the tolls remained predictable, whether the trade roads remained open, and whether the local officials appointed by Frederick treated them with fairness. Many in the region appreciated Frederick's quiet rule. He did not impose harsh penalties on minor offenses. He did not demand aggressive military service from his subjects. He invested in repairing bridges and mountain paths. While he often delayed decisions, the ones he eventually made tended to be reasonable and measured. If he had been more demanding, perhaps the people would have grown restless. But Frederick's softness gave them breathing room, even when it frustrated his more ambitious advisors. Still, you can sense that the foundations beneath this peaceful rhythm were beginning to shift. Power in the empire changed frequently. Alliances formed and dissolved. The Habsburg family, to which Frederick belonged, navigated a complex web of internal rivalries. A duke who moved slowly risked diminishing the influence of his branch of the family. A duke who appeared distracted risked attracting unwanted attention from more assertive relatives. And yet, Frederick remained who he was: gentle, contemplative, calm, and quietly attached to the soothing plants that softened the sharp edges of his thoughts. His life did not resemble the life of a warrior king or a commanding emperor. Instead, he lived as a man who preferred the tranquil corners of his castle, the company of those who understood his nature, and the comforting fog of herbal ease that carried him through the pressures of rule. As this first section closes, you might find yourself wondering how such a ruler managed to guide a territory of such strategic importance. How did the tension between his calm disposition and the increasing demands of the political world shape the future of his lands? And how long could a leader so inclined towards stillness continue to maintain authority in a realm that demanded movement? The second chapter of Frederick IV's story opens with the quiet hum of daily court life, continuing in its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the currents of the duchy had begun to shift more noticeably. Frederick remained steady in his gentle manner, content to move at a pace that soothed his mind, but the world around him did not always afford the luxury of stillness. As trade expanded and regional rivalries sharpened, a ruler who paused too long often found decisions being made on his behalf by those with less patience and more ambition. You may picture the castle in the Tyrol, as it stood during this period, perched high on its rocky vantage point, with views that stretched across valleys and mountain passes. The air remained crisp, even in summer, carrying the scent of pine, stone, and distant fires burning in village hearths. Inside the walls, hallways echoed softly with the footsteps of servants, the rattle of wooden shutters in the wind, and the murmured conversations of advisors who tried to manage the affairs of the duchy while waiting for their duke's attention. In these years, Frederick's preference for quiet contemplation grew stronger. He spent long stretches in the castle gardens or in private chambers filled with herbs he found comforting. His attendants, accustomed to these habits, maintained careful routines in preparing the infusions he drank throughout the day. These were brewed slowly, with herbs dried and sorted according to season, potency, and the altitude at which they grew. He believed that certain plants gathered near the tree line held a stronger calming effect, while others picked in lower valleys encouraged clarity of thought. Whether these beliefs were rooted in medicine or in habit mattered little, for they shaped the rhythm of his daily life. Meanwhile, Ulrich, his most loyal counselor, felt the growing pressure more keenly than anyone else at court. Ulrich was not a man inclined toward conflict, but he possessed a deeper sense of urgency than his ruler. He understood that the Tyrol controlled several major mountain crossings, and that the stability of these routes depended on maintaining good relationships with neighboring territories. Merchants needed protection from bandits who lurked on forested slopes. Miners needed consistent agreements with the Duke's officials regarding rights to silver veins and salt deposits. Envoys needed clear answers to questions about borders, tariffs and privileges. Yet Frederick's slow pace meant that many matters lingered unresolved for weeks or even seasons. Ulrich attempted to compensate for this by issuing provisional statements or suggesting temporary measures. These kept the duchy functioning but could not replace the authority of a fully engaged ruler. The nobles of surrounding regions noticed this gap and began seeking opportunities to shape events in their favor. One of these nobles was Duke Ernest, a distant relative within the broader Habsburg family. Ernest ruled lands to the east, and saw Frederick's calm nature as a weakness that could be quietly exploited. He sent envoys to Frederick with proposals for cooperative agreements that appeared harmless on the surface, yet contained subtle clauses that might shift influence away from the Tyrol. In another era, Frederick might have rejected such proposals firmly, but his inclination to study matters slowly gave Ernest a chance to press gently, always appearing cordial while steadily gaining ground. Ulrich recognized the danger. He repeatedly urged Frederick to respond decisively, but the Duke insisted on taking time to consider every phrase. He feared acting impulsively. He believed that hasty decisions led more often to regret than to stability. It was not stubbornness that guided him, but the deep-seated belief that calm contemplation was safer than rapid judgment. Yet, in the shifting political climate of the empire, stillness became its own form of vulnerability. Even so, Frederick was not entirely without resolve. When matters touched directly on the well-being of his subjects, he sometimes surprised his advisors with moments of clarity. During one of these intervals, he visited a high mountain village where landslides had damaged terraced fields. Villagers described their difficulty in transporting goods, and asked for assistance in repairing the path leading to the valley. Frederick listened carefully. Something in the villagers' steady determination moved him, perhaps because it echoed the quiet perseverance he valued. When he returned to the castle, he instructed his officials to allocate funds and labor for repairs. The work began before the first winter snows arrived, a rare moment when his contemplative nature aligned with timely action. These glimpses of decisiveness sustained the loyalty of many in the region. They respected Frederick's gentle habits, even when they worried about them. They knew he lacked the sharp ambition of some nobles, yet they trusted his intentions. For a time, that trust kept the duchy steady, but pressures continued to build. Merchants complained that rival lords in neighboring territories had begun imposing new tolls at border checkpoints, raising prices and slowing the movement of goods. These tolls challenged Frederick's authority over routes long considered central to the Tyrol's economy. If he did not respond, his revenues would decline, and the merchants who relied on those roads might begin to search for alternative paths under the protection of rival nobles. Ulrich presented these concerns repeatedly. He even brought detailed maps showing points where Frederick's authority was being quietly eroded. Each time Frederick listened with polite interest, yet his reaction came slowly. He asked questions about the placement of the checkpoints. He inquired about the history of the toll agreements, and yet he often ended the meetings by requesting more time to consider his response. While these discussions stretched on, power continued to shift. Duke Ernest strengthened his ties with several merchants by offering them reduced tolls. This gesture attracted commercial interest that might otherwise have remained within Frederick's domain. Ernest then used this growing influence to encourage further negotiations that favored his ambitions. In the midst of this subtle contest, Frederick's attention drifted increasingly toward the inner life of his court. He experimented with new herbal blends prepared by healers from remote valleys. These healers arrived with bundles of dried leaves wrapped in cloth, and spoke in dialects unfamiliar even to some of Frederick's attendants. The herbs they brought had earthy aromas and calming properties that Frederick found deeply soothing. He encouraged them to teach his household servants how to use the plants in infusions and in small resinous pouches placed near his bed to settle his sleep. Some at court whispered privately about these habits, wondering whether the Duke's fondness for such plants dulled his ability to govern effectively. Others argued that he had always been contemplative, even before he developed this fascination. Yet the question lingered, raised quietly, but often, whether a ruler who moved through life in such a tranquil haze could fully perceive the shifting patterns of power around him. Ulrich never confronted Frederick directly about this matter. He valued his duke and feared causing distress. Instead, he tried to redirect Frederick's attention by bringing him tangible reports from the mountain roads, detailed lists of merchant grievances, and first-hand accounts of how neighboring nobles were testing the boundaries of his authority. Sometimes Frederick responded, but more often he returned to thoughtful silence. Beyond the castle, the people of the Tyrol experienced both the benefits and the consequences of their duke's nature. They enjoyed a peaceful existence with few harsh edicts. Local disputes were handled patiently. Taxes rose only gradually, yet the growth of external pressures began affecting their lives in subtle ways. Traveling merchants reported increased delays and higher fees. Local officials found it harder to mediate conflicts when neighboring lords claimed rights to roads or grazing lands. Some families living near border regions felt torn between their long-standing loyalty to Frederick and the practical necessity of cooperating with other nobles who were more assertive in managing the territories. As these tensions grew, a series of small incidents eventually reached a point that demanded Frederick's direct involvement. In a valley near the eastern border, a group of merchants seeking passage to the Tyrol was detained by officers loyal to Duke Ernest. These officers claimed the merchants owed additional tolls for using a route that Ernest now considered under his jurisdiction. The merchants protested that the road had been maintained by Frederick's officials for generations. When they refused to pay, their goods were impounded. This incident, though minor in scale, carried symbolic weight. Ulrich brought the report to Frederick promptly. He explained that if such challenges went unanswered, Frederick's authority over the region would continue to weaken. At first Frederick responded with familiar calm, requesting further details. But when Ulrich described the confiscation of the merchant's cargo, something shifted. Frederick frowned, a rare expression of displeasure, and asked to see the written testimony from the merchants themselves. For several days he considered the matter carefully, reading the documents with quiet focus. His chamber windows remained open to the crisp mountain air as he studied each line. The soft scent of herbs lingered around him, but for once it did not seem to dull his clarity. When he finally summoned Ulrich, he spoke with a firmness that surprised even his most patient counselor. Frederick ordered that envoys be sent to Ernest, demanding the return of the seized goods and the restoration of traditional toll rights. He instructed his own officials to review the boundaries of the disputed route. He even authorized repairs to the road, asserting symbolically that it remained under his authority. For a moment it appeared that Frederick had rediscovered the resolve needed to preserve the stability of his duchy. Yet the question remained whether this renewed firmness would endure. For each moment of clarity, there were many in which he retreated once more into contemplation. His reliance on calming herbs, his gentle nature, and his preference for quiet reflection continued to shape the rhythm of his leadership. His people admired his kindness, but the wider political world pressed harder with each passing season. And so you were left wondering whether Frederick's quieter strengths could protect him from forces that thrived on speed and aggression. Could a ruler who moved so slowly hold his ground in a landscape where others advanced with deliberate ambition? Or would the fog of his contemplative habits eventually place his duchy at the mercy of more assertive hands? You have followed the trail of the monks of St. Felwyn, through the quiet stillness of their cloisters and the careful routines of their herb rooms. Now in this final part, you reach the point where their curious practices collided with the broader world beyond their stone walls. This conclusion gathers the lingering details of their daily smoke-filled rituals, the administrative burdens of their abbot, and the subtle shifting place of monastic culture in a changing medieval world. It is a story that moves slowly, more like a drifting wisp of incense than a march of events, yet within its slowness rests the essence of how monasteries functioned as islands that shaped the mainland around them. As the seasons passed at St. Felwyn, the monks continued their customary burning of herbs during evening readings, a practice that had begun generations earlier. To them, it was routine, no stranger than the steady turning of the prayer wheel or the soft strike of the hashed bell at dawn. The scent that rose from their mixture of common plants, dried flowers, and resinous shards had become part of the atmosphere of the abbey. Anyone who walked through the cloister walk during evening hours might catch that faint, sweet fog drifting upward toward the wooden rafters, swirling lazily before disappearing into the beams darkened by centuries of soot. What mattered most to those monks was not any sensation the smoke inspired, but rather the symbolism that underlay it. The smoke rising toward the roof represented prayer rising toward the heavens. The warmth of their small clay burners symbolized the warmth of spiritual intention. The careful gathering of herbs reflected the labor required to cultivate virtue, and the shared experience of breathing the same scented air tied them together in unity. In their eyes, none of it was indulgent. It was merely another thread in the long-woven tapestry of monastic life. Still, Not every outsider understood this. Travelers from nearby towns mentioned that the monks of St. Felwyn smelled constantly of herbs. Some joked that the brothers were too relaxed for men charged with spiritual rigor. Others whispered that the abbey must have discovered a plant with mystical qualities, although they could name no such thing. These comments rarely reached the abbot directly, but rumors have a way of bending through valleys and drifting through markets until they reach the ears of church officials. It came to the attention of the diocesan office when a visiting cleric noted the scented haze in the abbey's chapter house during his inspection. He was a stern man accustomed to quieter forms of devotion, and though he did not accuse the monks of wrongdoing, his raised brows were difficult to ignore. He wrote a short report that included a line about the unusual fragrance that surrounded the community. He suggested that someone with botanical expertise inspect the abbey's herbarium, not out of suspicion but out of puzzlement. This prompted a visit months later from Brother Aldwine, a monk respected for his knowledge of plants. He belonged to another monastery farther east, and had spent many years studying herb cultivation. Unlike the earlier visitor, Aldwine approached the matter with curiosity rather than concern. He wandered through St. Felwyn's small garden, bent over the raised beds, traced his fingers over the edges of leaves, and lifted small clumps of dried herbs from baskets in the storage room. What he found was precisely what the monks had always described. The herbs were common ones gathered from their own garden, or traded with nearby villagers: lavender, clary, rosemary, and a few varieties of mild sedatives that were routinely used in medieval medicine. Nothing rare, nothing dangerous, nothing even particularly interesting from a botanical standpoint. Aldwine recorded his findings in a brief parchment note, which he left with the abbot. He concluded that St. Felwyn's herbal smoke had no extraordinary effect and merely contributed to the distinctive scent of the abbey. One would think that such a conclusion would settle the matter entirely, but monasteries were rarely allowed to move through history without interference. A small but persistent curiosity lingered in local conversation. Townspeople spoke of the herbs with amusement. Traders joked about monks who walked slowly and smiled often. Even though Aldwine's report confirmed the harmlessness of the practice, the abbey's reputation acquired a gentle haze much like the fragrance that filled its cloisters. This subtle shift in perception shaped the monastery's interactions with the outside world. When villagers sought medicines for sleeplessness or aches, they often asked the monks for small bundles of the same herbs burned during their readings. The brothers obliged, tying bunches together with thin cords and handing them over with simple instructions. People began to believe that these herbs held calming power simply because the monks used them. The monks themselves did not argue. They understood that belief often carried more weight than fact in daily life. Meanwhile, inside the abbey, life continued with little change. Brother Edrin, whose gentle nature had once concerned some, became known for his skill in preparing herbal mixtures. The novices often sat beside him while he explained how to dry leaves evenly or how to store flowers, so their scent endured through the winter months. The abbot, though wary of outside gossip, recognized that maintaining long-standing customs mattered as much as protecting the monastery's reputation. He allowed the herbal smoke to continue, but with the added rule that the herb burners should not be used during official inspections or when guests were present unless necessary. The rhythm of life at St. Felwyn was defined by constancy. Days followed a steady cycle that repeated with minor shifts as the seasons changed. The monks rose in the deep blue stillness before dawn, prayed in the cold stone chapel, ate simple meals, worked in silence, copied manuscripts when assigned, and gathered again in the evening for their readings accompanied by the faint scent of herbs. These routines shaped their sense of time so that the outside world felt distant, almost irrelevant. Yet despite their isolation, the monastery could not remain untouched by wider events. Across the region, changes in royal policies affected land holdings. Shifting alliances among nobles brought uncertainty to rents and tithes. There were years when harvests were poor, and the abbey needed to assist struggling villagers. There were years when travelers carried tales of distant conflicts. Through it all, St. Felwyn endured by clinging to its slow methodical rhythms, using its herbal rituals as a steadying anchor. One quiet winter, a new novice named Harlan joined the abbey. He was young, earnest, and curious about everything. On his first evening, the soft cloud of herbal smoke puzzled him. He sat during the reading with his hands folded, breathing steadily as he observed the faint fog lifting from the clay burner. Afterward, he approached Brother Edrin and asked why the monastery used these herbs. Edrin explained the symbolism, the tradition, and the harmless nature of the plants. Harlan nodded, but seemed lost in thought. Days later, he mentioned to another novice that the scented air helped him concentrate. Word spread, and soon several novices confessed that the fragrance eased their minds during evening lessons. This innocent belief built another layer of myth around the abbey's customs. Though there was nothing extraordinary in the herbs, the perception that they brought calm or clarity made the practice feel more meaningful. And in truth, the structure of their days, the steady hum of routines, and the quiet companionship of the monks were far more influential than any plant they burned. But humans have a way of attaching significance to the smallest details, especially when those details become ritual. By the time years had passed, the abbey's reputation for sweet-scented evenings had grown into a local curiosity, not a scandal, and not quite an honor, but something noted in conversation. Travelers passing through the region might share that the monks of St. Felwyn were contemplative men who liked their air fragrant. Villagers might mention it with a smile when speaking of the brothers they sold herbs to, and clerics might occasionally reference the abbey when discussing the variety of monastic customs found throughout the countryside. The monks themselves, however, rarely thought about any of this. Their concern remained with prayer, work, and the steady maintenance of the abbey. Even the abbot, who had once worried that the herbal smoke might bring unwanted attention, came to accept that customs often take on lives of their own. As long as the monastery remained faithful to its duties, a little gossip about scented chambers harmed no one. In a broader sense, the story of St. Felwyn offers a quiet example of how monasteries shaped medieval life, not through dramatic events, but through their small, persistent habits. Their influence often spread through medicine, education, herb cultivation, manuscript copying, and the slow transmission of practices that blended practicality with symbolic meaning. The herbal smoke of St. Felwyn was only one such detail, but it reveals how communities built identities from layers of routine and perception, each one subtle but enduring. As the final years of the medieval period approached, many monasteries faced changes that reshaped their existence. Some grew wealthier and more administratively complex. Others struggled with economic pressures. But through these transformations, the monks of St. Felwyn kept their humble traditions, and their evening herbal readings continued long after the original purpose of the practice had faded into the distant haze of memory. You might wonder, as you consider their story, how many other small monastic customs slipped quietly into obscurity, carrying with them the unrecorded thoughts of those who lived within stone walls. What other rituals, lost to time, shaped the quiet inner worlds of communities that left only faint traces in written history? You now turn to one of the quieter figures of the later medieval courts, a noble whose influence never relied on battlefield triumphs or political maneuvering. Instead, he shaped the memory of his duchy through soft routines, personal oddities, and botanical interests that few contemporaries understood. This is the story of Duke Alaric of Hohenwald, a man remembered not for sweeping reforms or dramatic conflicts, but for the unusual serenity that surrounded his court. His household was marked by calm rhythms, subdued conversations, and a fragrant haze that drifted lazily through the upper halls of his residence. The origins of that haze, and the rumors that followed it, form the starting point of this story. Duke Alaric inherited his position during a period of relative peace. The regional conflicts that had troubled his father's rule had cooled, and the nearby nobles maintained a cautious stability with one another. Rather than turning his attention to war or political expansion, Alaric devoted himself to the quieter obligations of governance. He held councils regularly, ensured that taxes were collected without excessive burden, and kept a careful eye on trade routes that passed through his forests. His decisions were steady and predictable, which earned him a reputation for reliability. Yet to those who visited his court, it was clear that the duke possessed a temperament unlike that of most nobles of his time. The first thing guests noticed was the scent. When entering the main hall, one detected a thin, pleasant fragrance, something floral yet earthy, lingering along the ceiling beams and clinging to the tapestries. It was not overpowering, nor was it the heavy perfume favored by wealthier courts. Instead, it carried a sense of warmth, as though the air itself had softened. Servants seemed unaffected, moving about their duties with steady deliberation, as if the palace enforced a natural calm. The source of the scent was no secret. Alaric kept a garden behind the palace, sheltered by stone walls and arranged with exquisite precision. This garden was his true passion. In it grew rosemary, lavender, valerian, mint, borage, meadowsweet, and other common herbs, cultivated with meticulous care. The herbs were harvested, dried, and stored in clay jars. Some were used for medicines, others for cooking, and still others for what the duke referred to simply as evening comfort. Evening comfort consisted of burning small bundles of herbs in bronze dishes placed around the hall during nightly readings. It was a tradition he adopted from a cleric who had once visited the palace and mentioned that certain monastic communities used similar mixtures to create focus and discourage distraction during study. Alaric found the idea appealing. He ordered his steward to prepare several shallow bowls, lined them with sand, and instructed attendants to place the dried herbs atop slow-burning embers. Over time, this became a daily routine, a quiet ritual the Duke observed with unwavering dedication. Many found the practice strange, though harmless. Some visiting nobles teased him gently, remarking that the Duke seemed perpetually relaxed. A few suspected the herbs carried unusual effects, though none could identify anything beyond the most ordinary plants. Others, perhaps influenced by tales from distant regions, wondered if the Duke relied on these fragrances to ease anxieties or calm his thoughts. Medieval courts were accustomed to rumors, and the gentlest habits could become fuel for speculation. Despite whispered commentary, Alaric remained indifferent to gossip. His days revolved around consistent patterns. He rose before the sun, walked the perimeter of the palace grounds, inspected the garden, held council sessions until the noon bell, and spent the afternoons reading through letters, accounts, and treaties. Instead of jousting or hunting, he preferred slow strolls through his orchard or visits to the scribes who maintained his archives. Yet the Duke's household did not revolve solely around administrative calm. There were hints that the herbs he favored symbolized something deeper. Alaric had grown up during a difficult period. Records describe his father as stern and demanding, and his childhood filled with long lessons in warfare, diplomacy, and statecraft. He did not inherit an easy temperament. In the few surviving letters written by his tutors, they describe a boy who struggled with restlessness, who found it difficult to sleep, and who maintained an inward quiet that bordered on brooding. When he discovered gardening in his later years, the practice appeared to soften these qualities. Working with soil and plants gave him purpose beyond the expectations of rulership. This connection between botany and inner balance shaped his approach to leadership. He believed that care, patience, and measured attention produced better outcomes than force or aggression. When disputes arose among minor nobles, he encouraged mediation rather than confrontation. When merchants complained of unfair tolls, he reviewed the matter personally rather than delegating it to bailiffs. Even his military commanders noted that the Duke valued long-term stability over swift displays of power. The evening herb rituals reflected this philosophy. During the readings, courtiers gathered quietly, listening to chronicles, moral treatises, or poetry. The fragrant haze drifted through the hall, as the Duke sat with hands folded, absorbing each word with surprising attentiveness. The atmosphere discouraged loud discussions or political scheming. Even those predisposed to rivalry found themselves subdued by the gentle rhythm of the evening. Still, not everyone approved. A few neighboring nobles viewed Alaric's approach as weakness. They expected the ruler of Hohenwald to demonstrate stronger assertiveness, particularly when resolving land disputes along the forest edge. Some accused him of being overly contemplative. Others, more cynical, joked that the Duke breathed so much scented smoke that he had forgotten how to command. These criticisms occasionally surfaced in formal correspondence, though always phrased with politeness. The church, too, maintained mixed opinions. A visiting bishop remarked that the Duke's evening rituals resembled monastic customs more than courtly ones. While he acknowledged that the herbs were harmless, he worried that the palace blurred the line between noble and clerical traditions. The bishop also noted that such practices could encourage speculation among the lower classes, who tended to misinterpret unfamiliar rituals. His letter, though diplomatic, hinted that the palace should avoid unnecessary eccentricities. Alaric responded with his characteristic restraint. He scaled back the number of herb burners used within the hall when guests were present, and he instructed servants to ensure proper ventilation, but he did not abandon the practice. He viewed it as an essential part of his routine, one that grounded him amid the pressures of governance. Life within the palace continued much as it always had. Servants followed predictable schedules. The chamberlains managed provisions efficiently. Scribes copied documents with disciplined strokes. The Duke maintained a modest but respected court, known more for its tranquility than its grandeur. In some ways, this quiet atmosphere was precisely why musicians, scholars, and craftsmen enjoyed visiting. They found in Hohenwald a refuge from the noise of larger cities and a place where work could be done with concentration. One small event, however, began to shift the perception of the Duke's herbal habits. During a harvest festival held in the palace square, a group of villagers presented Alaric with a wreath intertwined with several of the same herbs used in his evening rituals. They explained that they believed the Duke's garden brought peace to the region and wished to honor his calming presence. Their words carried no flattery but genuine appreciation. They described how disputes in their villages had decreased, how trade routes had become more orderly, and how they believed the Duke's gentle manner influenced the local atmosphere. Alaric accepted the wreath with humility, though he addressed the villagers firmly, reminding them that order came from consistent effort, not superstition. Still, the moment touched him. It revealed that the fragrance of his herb-filled halls had traveled far beyond the palace, not through physical means, but through reputation. People had begun to associate him with calm, steadiness, and patience. Whether or not his rituals contributed to that perception mattered little. What mattered was that his leadership had shaped life in ways he never intended. This realization prompted the Duke to reflect on the relationship between private habits and public identity. He had never sought to influence others through his garden. His goal had always been inward, to bring stability to his own thoughts so he could govern responsibly. Yet people saw patterns, and from those patterns they built beliefs. In medieval society, where understanding of plants, medicine, and temperament often blended into a single worldview, it was natural for villagers to imagine that a peaceful duke must rely on peaceful herbs. This perception grew slowly, taking on a life of its own. Travelers began to mention Hohenwald as a serene place. Merchants described the duke as contemplative and even tempered, and peasants noted that the palace never erupted into the sort of turmoil witnessed elsewhere. Whether these impressions were accurate or merely convenient stories hardly mattered, because they shaped how people approached the duchy and how they behaved within it. Yet, beneath this calm exterior lay uncertainties that would influence the next part of the story. The duke's gentle approach, though admired by many, left certain issues unresolved. Border tensions lingered. A faction of nobles continued to doubt his strength, and a new set of political developments beyond the forest was beginning to reach the edge of his lands. You might wonder whether the tranquil routines of the Duke's palace, supported by the faint fragrance of his cherished herbs, could endure the pressures that were slowly advancing toward Hohenwald. Would this delicate balance hold, or would the peaceful haze be disrupted by forces far less gentle? As the seasons turned, Duke Alaric's court continued its quiet rhythms, but the world beyond the stone walls of Hohenwald began to exert pressures that even his careful habits could not entirely deflect. The once distant disputes of neighboring nobles crept closer, and the slow wheels of imperial politics began to grind against the soft pace of his duchy. While the fragrance of herbs and the gentle routines of the palace provided a sense of serenity within, they could not entirely shield the Duke or his subjects from external tensions. Trade remained the lifeblood of the region. The mountain roads that wound past forests and rivers carried merchants from distant towns, each hoping to sell cloth, salt, timber, or metals. Alaric's approach to oversight of these routes was measured. Tolls were collected with fairness, road maintenance ensured safe passage, and minor disputes were mediated with care. This created stability that the villagers appreciated, yet it also revealed an important vulnerability. Competitors in neighboring regions observed how patiently Alaric allowed matters to unfold, and some began to test the boundaries of his authority. A merchant traveling east reported that a distant noble had imposed additional levies on goods in transit, subtly redirecting trade away from Hohenwald. These small, almost imperceptible challenges could accumulate, threatening the duchy's economy if not addressed. Alaric's closest advisors, particularly a man named Conrad, grew increasingly concerned. They recognized the Duke's steady temperament as a virtue in many respects, yet they feared that patience alone would not suffice in a climate of incremental encroachments. Conrad's role was delicate. He needed to raise issues without provoking irritation or undermining the serene structure. Alaric valued, he began preparing reports that emphasized the subtle shifts in trade, noting which roads showed signs of neglect or which agreements required reaffirmation. He presented these reports at dusk, after the evening herb burners had been lit, creating a rhythm that Alaric could absorb without disruption to his accustomed calm. Despite Conrad's careful efforts, certain matters demanded more immediate action. A group of forest nobles began clearing timber along lands disputed with Hohenwald. While the Duke traditionally sought negotiation before confrontation, he understood that continued inaction could invite more aggressive claims. Alaric decided to visit the affected lands personally, accompanied by a small retinue of loyal officers. The journey through misty woods and winding paths was slow, deliberate, and allowed the Duke to observe the land firsthand. He noted the patterns of erosion along riverbanks, the placement of old boundary markers, and the response of local villagers to the encroachment. The visit illuminated both the strengths and the limitations of his leadership. On the one hand, his presence reassured locals, showing that their duke cared about their lands. On the other hand, the slow, observational nature of the inspection allowed rival nobles time to fortify their positions or subtly manipulate claims. Alaric instructed his officials to document the boundaries carefully and to draft letters emphasizing his authority over the land, but even these efforts were slower than the rivals might have preferred. It was a dance of patience, one that required careful balance between assertiveness and restraint. Back at the palace, the influence of his botanical habits played a more strategic role than many realized. The evening herb burners, once considered a purely personal indulgence, had an unexpected effect. They cultivated an atmosphere of calm among his court. Advisors, scribes, and stewards, who might have been prone to hasty arguments or disputes, found themselves moving in measured steps, their focus sharpened by the consistent routines. The haze of rosemary, lavender, and other gentle herbs helped create an environment in which measured discussion became the norm rather than the exception. This contributed subtly to the maintenance of stability, even when external pressures increased. Nevertheless, there were moments when the serene approach proved insufficient. Correspondence from the emperor's court indicated that minor nobles across the region were forming alliances that could challenge Hohenwald's influence. Alaric read these letters in quiet reflection, his hands resting on the wooden table while the aromatic smoke curled around him. He considered the implications carefully. Acting too hastily could provoke confrontation. Acting too slowly risked eroding authority. He weighed options, seeking solutions that allowed for the preservation of calm while asserting necessary influence. During one council, a dispute arose among 3 local merchants who claimed overlapping rights to a river-crossing toll. Their arguments became heated, voices rising beyond the polite murmurs usually maintained at court. Alaric, seated beneath the ceiling beams where the faint scent of herbs lingered, listened patiently. He allowed each party to present its case fully, asking clarifying questions in a deliberate manner. When all sides had spoken, he instructed a neutral officer to review prior agreements and present a recommendation. The solution he ultimately proposed was a compromise that maintained fairness while subtly reinforcing his authority. The merchants departed satisfied, though some recognized that the duke's patience had been a quiet form of power itself. In the months that followed, Alaric continued to navigate the dual pressures of governance and perception. His routines remained consistent, yet he increasingly devoted time to correspondence and intelligence gathering, seeking to understand subtle shifts in neighboring territories. Letters arrived daily, some reporting economic concerns, others hinting at potential alliances or disputes. Alaric often read them in his private chambers, accompanied by the familiar fragrance of his herb blends. The smell, far from being a mere indulgence, had become a form of ritual focus, allowing him to approach each problem with a deliberate clarity that might have been difficult in a more ordinary environment. Yet, there were limits to this approach. Certain nobles, particularly younger and more ambitious men, perceived the duke's calm demeanor as an opportunity. They attempted to assert influence through petitions, minor disputes, or even veiled threats, testing the boundaries of his patience. Alaric faced these challenges without outward anger, responding in measured tones while carefully evaluating long-term consequences. He understood that each decision sent signals, not only to the immediate parties but to the broader network of regional actors. Amid these tensions, Alaric also sought to preserve the inner life of his court. The evening readings continued, sometimes extending later than usual if correspondence required reflection or if council matters demanded subtle negotiation. The herb burners released their fragrant haze, which intertwined with the quiet voices of scribes, copying letters, and the soft rustle of parchments being turned. These routines, though seemingly trivial, served as a stabilizing counterpoint to the complex and often unpredictable currents flowing through the region. By the end of the second year of these mounting challenges, Alaric's approach had proven resilient in some ways, but fragile in others. Trade routes remained largely secure, local disputes were often resolved without escalation, and the court maintained a disciplined calm. However, the external pressures of ambitious neighbors, shifting alliances, and the expectations of the emperor's court meant that the peaceful rhythms of Hohenwald were under constant threat. Even a single misstep could allow more assertive actors to gain leverage, and Alaric remained acutely aware of this delicate balance. As the season turned toward winter, a subtle tension hung over the palace. The fragrance of herbs still drifted softly through the halls, but beyond the garden walls, the first snows were already coating distant passes. Messages arrived more slowly, and travelers returning from nearby territories carried tales of changes in alliances and small disruptions in trade. Alaric understood that the coming months would test his measured methods in ways they had not yet been tested. His patience, the very quality that had preserved peace for so long, might now be insufficient to respond to the demands of a more assertive and unpredictable world. And so, as this second section of the story closes, you are left with a question that mirrors the subtle anxieties of the Duke himself. Can the gentle, deliberate practices of a calm ruler withstand the pressures of a world that values speed, decisiveness, and aggression? Or will the careful haze of herbs and contemplation prove too delicate a shield against the advancing ambitions of those who do not pause? The final chapter of Duke Alaric's story finds him navigating the convergence of quiet routine and mounting external pressures. The peaceful haze of his herb-filled chambers, once thought a personal indulgence, had become a subtle instrument of governance, shaping the minds and behaviors of those around him. Yet the challenges from neighboring nobles, shifting alliances, and the demands of imperial oversight could not be ignored. The story now reaches its conclusion, where measured patience meets decisive action, and the delicate balance of calm leadership is tested to its limits. Winter had fully arrived when the first signs of confrontation became unavoidable. Snow blanketed the mountain passes, slowing travel and isolating villages along the borderlands. Letters from neighboring territories reported disputes over trade tolls, while subtle military movements hinted at ambitions that could affect Hohenwald's autonomy. Some envoys arrived with threats veiled in polite language, challenging Alaric's authority in ways that could no longer be mediated with words alone. Yet the Duke did not abandon his characteristic patience. He gathered his advisors and reviewed reports with meticulous care. The familiar fragrance of rosemary and lavender filled the private chambers, mingling with the warmth of the hearth. Alaric encouraged discussion, allowing each advisor to voice opinions while he considered their implications fully. The court moved slowly, deliberately, but there was no lack of strategy in their actions. Each recommendation was weighed, each alliance considered, and each response timed to maintain the delicate equilibrium of influence. One decisive moment came when a neighboring noble, emboldened by months of tentative gains, attempted to assert control over a critical mountain toll. This action threatened both Hohenwald's revenue and the well-being of merchants dependent on the route. Alaric's usual calm did not falter, yet he recognized the need for clear, immediate response. He summoned envoys from the offending territory, presenting his case with measured authority. While his tone remained gentle, the clarity of his demands left little room for misinterpretation. The toll route belonged to Hohenwald, and any encroachment would be addressed through formal channels of the empire if necessary. The envoy, expecting hesitation, was taken aback. Alaric's deliberate calm carried an unexpected force. By maintaining composure while asserting clear boundaries, the Duke achieved a resolution that preserved peace without violence. The toll remained under Hohenwald's authority, and the merchant routes continued to operate smoothly. For once, the combination of patience, observation, and quiet authority proved sufficient to navigate the pressures of a competitive political landscape. Within the palace, life continued with familiar rhythms. The herb burners remained lit in the evenings, filling halls with their soft fragrance. Courtiers and scribes moved with careful precision, responding to the Duke's guidance while absorbing the calming environment he had cultivated over years. Alaric's personal practices, once considered eccentric or indulgent, had now demonstrated a functional value. They shaped focus, encouraged thoughtful deliberation, and helped temper the impulses of those who might otherwise act hastily. Yet even in this success, the limitations of his approach were apparent. The neighboring nobles' challenge had been resolved, but the broader currents of ambition and change remained. Hohenwald's calm approach could not prevent shifts in trade patterns, the ambitions of more assertive rulers, or the gradual evolution of imperial authority. Alaric recognized that leadership required constant adjustment, and that even the most deliberate routines could not eliminate uncertainty. The fragrance of herbs and the slow cadence of the court were tools, not shields. In reflecting on the outcomes of these events, it becomes clear that Duke Alaric's legacy was defined less by grand battles or sweeping reforms, and more by the careful cultivation of environment, perception, and habit. His calm demeanor, supported by ritual and botanical focus, allowed him to maintain stability where other rulers might have faltered. He preserved the integrity of Hohenwald, not through force alone, but through patient attention, thoughtful response, and the quiet influence of consistent practices. As the final days of this period unfolded, Villagers and merchants alike continued to recognize the subtle effects of the Duke's methods. Disputes were often resolved peacefully, trade moved reliably, and the court's calm persisted despite external challenges. The sensory environment, the fragrance of herbs, the measured pacing of activities, and the deliberate tone of council meetings became intertwined with perceptions of order and authority. Hohenwald thrived not because it was the most forceful or ambitious duchy in the region, but because it maintained an internal balance that could accommodate both stability and measured responses to external pressures. And yet, as the Duke walked through the quiet halls of his palace on the final evening recounted in these chronicles, one could sense that the story remained open-ended. The pressures of the broader world continued to press against the boundaries of Hohenwald. Trade, politics, and neighboring ambitions would not pause indefinitely. The gentle haze that had shaped both perception and practice was fragile, subject to the changing winds of circumstance and the choices of future leaders. Alaric's story closes then, not with dramatic conquest or catastrophic failure, but with the lingering reflection that leadership can take many forms. Patience, routine, and careful attention to subtle influences can preserve order even in a turbulent world. Yet the sustainability of such methods depends on the capacity of leaders to recognize the shifting environment, adjust practices when necessary, and maintain equilibrium amid forces that move more rapidly than one might wish. You are left with a quiet question, the one that hovers as softly as the scent of herbs in the palace halls. In a world that prizes speed and aggression, can deliberate, contemplative leadership endure across generations? Or will the gentle methods of one ruler be gradually eroded by those who act without hesitation? In the rolling hills of northern Franconia, there lived a duke whose reputation was built not upon armies or alliances, but upon a peculiar devotion to listening. Duke Heinrich the Quiet, as he came to be known, ruled his lands with a method that many contemporaries found perplexing. His court moved at a measured pace, dominated less by the bustle of edicts and proclamations and more by the careful rhythm of observation, consultation, and reflection. His habits, at first glance, appeared uneventful. Reading letters slowly, walking through the palace gardens at dawn, attending council meetings in silence. But these practices concealed an unusual acuity that allowed him to navigate the subtleties of human behavior with remarkable precision. The palace itself was an extension of this philosophy. Constructed along a ridge that overlooked fertile valleys and meandering rivers, it combined austere stone fortifications with open gardens where the wind carried both sound and scent. Hallways were broad but sparsely furnished, intended to minimize distractions and echo the calm of the Duke's mind. Courtiers quickly learned that sudden interruptions or loud disputes were not welcome in Heinrich's presence. Instead, they brought reports and petitions and awaited his silent contemplation before speaking further. This enforced a certain discipline within the court, one that encouraged clarity and focus over impulse. Heinrich's daily schedule reflected his methodical temperament. He rose before the sun, walking slowly through the dew-laden gardens, noting the growth of herbs, the direction of the wind, and the behaviors of small animals along the paths. He believed that observation was as much a form of instruction as any formal education. From these quiet excursions, he drew lessons about patience, resilience, and the interplay between environment and human activity. Gardeners and attendants who accompanied him learned to notice details they would otherwise have overlooked: the subtle color of leaves indicating soil quality, the faint sound of distant livestock signaling changes in weather, or the delicate balance of moisture along a stream that ensured irrigation worked effectively. Council meetings in the palace were equally deliberate. Nobles presented their reports, advisors laid out accounts, and scribes recorded events. Heinrich often remained silent for long stretches, allowing each participant to elaborate fully. It was said that he could hear more in silence than others could detect in hours of discussion. His responses, when they came, were precise and often contained insight that revealed an understanding deeper than any casual observer would expect. At times, his patience frustrated those who desired swift action, yet it also prevented rash decisions that could destabilize his duchy. Despite the calm within the palace walls, the Duke's realm was not without challenges. Northern Franconia was dotted with minor feudal lords, each with ambitions that sometimes conflicted with one another. Peasant revolts, though rare, could flare when harvests failed, or when tolls and levies pressed too heavily on fragile livelihoods. Traders brought news from distant towns of new tolls, regulations, and shifting alliances. Unlike other rulers, Heinrich did not rush to intervene. He preferred to gather information, cross-reference reports, and wait for patterns to emerge. This approach created an air of mystery around him, one that made both allies and rivals uncertain of his intentions. Within this environment, small, seemingly trivial practices carried greater significance. Heinrich maintained an unusual affinity for subtle scents, particularly the mild aromas of dried herbs and flowers. He kept small pouches of lavender, rosemary and thyme in his chambers, and allowed their gentle fragrance to mingle with the natural air of the palace. He claimed that these scents aided focus and calm, though advisors speculated that they also reflected a preference for the quiet pleasures of life over more ostentatious indulgences. Regardless of their origin, these small elements of routine contributed to the distinctive atmosphere that defined the court, disciplined, reflective, and unhurried. One notable aspect of Heinrich's rule involved the treatment of complaints and petitions from his subjects. Rather than issuing immediate judgments or passing the matter to subordinates, he listened to each individual in turn. Village elders, merchants, and even wandering scholars found themselves seated in modest chambers where the Duke would hear their accounts in silence, often for hours at a stretch. The process was slow, yet it cultivated trust. Those who might have feared arbitrary rulings left reassured that their concerns had been fully understood. By observing expressions, tone, and even hesitation, Heinrich gleaned information about social dynamics, intentions, and potential conflicts that might otherwise have remained invisible. This practice was not without risk. Rivals occasionally attempted to exploit his patience, testing boundaries to see if the Duke would respond with weakness. Some nobles assumed that silence equated to indecision, and for a brief time, a coalition of neighboring lords attempted to redirect trade routes and influence local appointments. Yet Heinrich's silence was strategic rather than passive. By waiting, he allowed these maneuvers to unfold in full view, gathering evidence about character, alliances, and strategy that would later inform decisive actions. His interventions, when they finally came, were measured and precisely targeted, often neutralizing threats before they could escalate into full conflict. The Duke's reliance on quiet observation extended even to his daily interactions with family and attendants. Meals were taken without excess conversation. Conversations were brief and purposeful, and gestures were observed carefully. A sudden cough, a lingering glance, or a subtle shift in posture could reveal hidden information about intentions or feelings. Over time, those in his immediate household learned to conduct themselves with restraint, understanding that the smallest details mattered under the watchful eye of their Duke. Yet for all his methodical skill, there were questions about sustainability. Could such a slow, deliberate approach withstand the pressures of a changing political landscape? The world beyond Franconia moved with increasing speed. Commerce expanded, rival nobles acted with growing assertiveness, and the emperor's attention sometimes brought unexpected mandates. Heinrich's quiet patience, while effective in maintaining order within his own borders, could not fully shield him from these external currents. Each decision carried weight. Each moment of inaction risked allowing others to shape events in ways beyond his control. Even so, within the duchy, his methods bore fruit. Disputes were rarely violent, trade flowed steadily, and peasants and merchants alike came to respect the methodical and attentive nature of their ruler. The combination of attentive listening, patient observation, and subtle environmental cues created a governance style that was unusual for the time, but quietly effective. Heinrich's legacy, at this stage, was already forming, not through conquest or dramatic legislation, but through the cultivation of understanding, perception, and measured action. As this section draws to a close, you might consider the delicate balance Heinrich maintained. The very practices that allowed him to perceive the subtleties of his court could also leave him vulnerable to more aggressive actors. How long could patience, observation, and calm maintain the stability of a realm when the world beyond moved with relentless speed? Could the silent Duke's methods continue to protect his people, or would the pressures of ambition, commerce, and politics test the limits of even the most measured ruler? As the seasons progressed, Duke Heinrich's patient methods were increasingly tested by the subtle but persistent pressures from neighboring lords, imperial authorities, and the economic realities of his duchy. Northern Franconia, though geographically sheltered by hills and rivers, was far from isolated. Messages arrived from distant towns, describing shifting alliances, unexpected taxes, and even rumors of unrest in regions several days' travel away. Each letter or messenger carried information that required careful consideration, for an impulsive response could upset the delicate balance Heinrich had cultivated within his borders. Heinrich responded with meticulous attention. Every report was read slowly, every statement cross-referenced with prior knowledge, and every messenger's demeanor observed with precision. The Duke's chambers, already scented with the gentle fragrances of lavender, rosemary and thyme, became an environment for reflection. These small comforts were far from trivial. They helped the Duke maintain focus during long hours of contemplation, and lent a sense of continuity amid the shifting currents of politics. Advisors often noted that he seemed to think more clearly in the presence of these familiar scents, as if the aroma itself structured his attention and sharpened perception. External pressures soon presented a tangible challenge. A coalition of minor lords, dissatisfied with his slow approach to border disputes and toll enforcement, attempted to assert influence over a trade route critical to Franconia's economy. Their strategy was subtle, a combination of minor legal challenges, ambiguous claims to forest lands, and the quiet encouragement of local merchants to redirect goods along alternative paths. The coalition's intent was not outright conflict, but incremental advantage, hoping that Heinrich's patience would prevent him from acting decisively. The Duke responded in a manner consistent with his established methods. He sent envoys to gather full reports from the disputed areas, visiting villages and observing traders in motion. These visits were deliberate, conducted slowly and unobtrusively, allowing him to witness the interactions firsthand. In doing so, he not only gathered factual information, but also observed the behavior of local actors, the subtle gestures, tone of voice, and hesitations that revealed intentions beyond the written record. By the time he had fully assessed the situation, the coalition had revealed its patterns, ambitions, and weaknesses, without the Duke needing to initiate confrontation. Within the palace, Heinrich's continued use of herbal scents and quiet routines provided a stabilizing influence. Even as tensions increased, the evening readings continued, accompanied by the familiar fragrances of dried herbs. Courtiers and scribes maintained calm, and the atmosphere of contemplation discouraged hasty arguments or impulsive advice. The slow cadence of life within the palace contrasted sharply with the rising pressure outside, yet it allowed the Duke to respond with precision rather than reaction. An important test arose when one of the neighboring lords attempted to influence local officials through bribery. This individual sought to circumvent Heinrich's authority by offering gifts to minor stewards, hoping they would enforce policies favorable to the outsider. Heinrich, informed of the attempt, did not act immediately. Instead, he observed, questioned, and recorded. Within weeks, the full scope of the effort became apparent, revealing both the methods of the rival and the limits of local compliance. By waiting, Heinrich turned what might have been a partial threat into an opportunity to reinforce loyalty through careful appointments, subtle rewards, and quiet acknowledgement of those who had resisted corruption. This approach required constant attention and careful management of perception. Heinrich understood that authority was maintained not solely through edicts, but through the beliefs of those who lived under his governance. The consistency of his routines, the calm council meetings, the measured listening, the attention to small details, reinforced his image as a deliberate and attentive ruler. The fragrance of herbs, the quiet gardens, and the deliberate cadence of the court all contributed to this perception, shaping the behavior of subjects and courtiers alike. At the same time, Heinrich remained attentive to the human consequences of his decisions. Villages along the trade routes required ongoing support to maintain infrastructure, and disputes over land or tolls could easily escalate if mishandled. The Duke ensured that messengers were dispatched to investigate claims fully, that negotiations were conducted patiently, and that resolutions were balanced in a way that preserved both fairness and authority. By addressing underlying issues rather than merely suppressing complaints, he strengthened loyalty and minimized resentment. Yet the growing complexity of his environment revealed limits to even the most patient methods. Some rival nobles grew impatient with the absence of visible enforcement, and began testing the boundaries of their influence. Merchants increasingly demanded quicker resolutions to disputes, and the emperor's attention occasionally brought mandates that required action before all details could be assessed. These pressures forced Heinrich to balance the careful deliberation that defined his style with the need to act decisively when timing was critical. The Duke's skill lay in his ability to combine observation with strategic timing. By waiting until all relevant information was gathered, and by understanding the motivations of those involved, he could act with authority that appeared effortless. Decisions made without haste carried weight precisely because they were rare and deliberate, signaling to both allies and rivals that the Duke's patience was not weakness but a form of insight. Despite these successes, uncertainties remained. The coalition of nobles testing the trade routes had not been entirely neutralized. Some merchants, influenced by outside pressures, still considered alternative paths, and the broader political landscape of the empire was increasingly complex, with shifting alliances and emerging regional powers. Heinrich's methods had preserved stability so far, But the question of sustainability loomed over every action. As winter gave way to early spring, the court returned to its familiar routines, but the Duke remained acutely aware that subtle threats persisted. The fragrance of herbs continued to fill the palace, and the slow rhythm of council meetings persisted. Yet beneath this calm surface lay the constant calculation of timing, influence, and perception. Heinrich's ability to maintain equilibrium depended on vigilance, patience, and an acute awareness of both human behavior and environmental cues. And so, as this second section concludes, you are left considering the central tension of his rule. Can the deliberate, measured patience of a ruler succeed indefinitely against the pressures of ambition, shifting alliances, and economic necessity? Or is there a point at which even the most careful observation must yield to decisive action, with consequences that are impossible to predict? As spring unfolded across northern Franconia, Duke Heinrich's patient strategies were tested in ways he could not have fully anticipated. The subtle pressures from neighboring nobles, merchants, and imperial authorities had intensified, yet the duchy remained remarkably stable. Heinrich's ability to combine observation, measured action, and the quiet influence of his routines had carried him through months of incremental challenges, demonstrating the effectiveness of a leadership style grounded in patience and perception. The coalition of nobles attempting to manipulate trade routes had been carefully observed over the winter months. Each action, each petition, and each informal negotiation provided Heinrich with the information he needed to craft an appropriate response. When he finally acted, he did so decisively yet calmly. Clear instructions were sent to local officials, reinforcing toll rights, the routes were inspected and maintained, and trade agreements were subtly amended to strengthen Hohenwald's position without provoking open conflict. The result was a resolution that protected the duchy's economic interests while minimizing the risk of confrontation, a testament to the power of deliberate strategy over impulsive reaction. Within the palace, life continued in its familiar rhythm. The evening readings remained a cornerstone of daily practice, accompanied by the subtle fragrances of lavender, rosemary, and thyme. Courtiers, scribes, and advisors moved through the halls with quiet focus, their attention sharpened by the calm environment. The scents, the routines, and the measured cadence of the court reinforced the Duke's presence, ensuring that even in moments of external tension, internal stability was preserved. Heinrich's attention to detail extended beyond political maneuvering. He continued his walks through the palace gardens each morning, noting the growth of herbs, the condition of the soil, and the habits of the animals that frequented the grounds. These observations, though seemingly mundane, informed his broader understanding of the duchy. Subtle environmental cues often foreshadowed challenges in agriculture, trade, or local governance, allowing him to act before small issues became major problems. In this way, his attentiveness to the ordinary aspects of life became a critical instrument of leadership. The Duke also maintained his practice of listening attentively to subjects, merchants, and envoys. During council sessions and private audiences, he allowed individuals to speak without interruption, observing tone, posture, and hesitation. This method provided insights far beyond the content of the words spoken, revealing motivations, loyalties, and potential conflicts before they fully manifested. Even in moments of apparent calm, Heinrich remained acutely aware of the underlying currents of human behavior that shaped his realm. By mid-year, the results of these careful strategies became evident. Trade routes stabilized, local disputes were resolved without violence, and the coalition of challenging nobles had been subtly neutralized. Villagers, merchants, and minor officials recognized the efficacy of the Duke's approach. While he did not command with loud decrees or showy displays of force, his presence and measured actions ensured fairness, order, and stability. The duchy thrived not through intimidation or conquest, but through the quiet, deliberate cultivation of understanding and trust. Yet even in this apparent success, Heinrich remained cautious. He knew that the external world continued to change, that new alliances could form, and that unforeseen events, famine, disease, or imperial mandates, might disrupt the fragile equilibrium he had maintained. His leadership, though effective, depended upon constant vigilance, thoughtful observation, and the willingness to act decisively when circumstances demanded. The lessons of patience and perception were powerful, but they were not infallible. The final months of the year were marked by a reflection upon the subtleties of influence and the long-term impact of leadership. Heinrich considered how the quiet routines, the careful listening, and the gentle fragrances that filled his palace had shaped not only the perception of his court, but also the behavior of those who lived within the duchy. What had begun as a personal approach to calm and focus had, over time, created a system of governance that allowed small voices to be heard, disputes to be resolved peacefully, and the complex machinery of the duchy to operate smoothly. He understood, however, that this delicate balance was not guaranteed to endure. Leadership was an ongoing negotiation with both human nature and circumstance. Even the most measured ruler must recognize the limits of patience, the inevitability of change, and the necessity of decisive action when observation alone could no longer suffice. Heinrich's story, therefore, closes not with a dramatic battle or a decisive confrontation, but with the quiet affirmation that leadership can take many forms, and that subtle, attentive practices can be as powerful as forceful action in preserving stability and guiding the course of history. As you reflect on Duke Heinrich's life and methods, a lingering question remains. In a world often dominated by bold gestures and swift action, how might the quiet, patient, and attentive practices of a single ruler influence events beyond immediate perception, and how might such methods shape the legacy of leadership across generations? In the dense forests and rolling plains of southwestern England, there lived an earl whose approach to leadership was defined by precision, observation, and a remarkable devotion to timing. Earl William of Blackwood, known to his contemporaries as the Measured, ruled his lands with a methodical approach that contrasted sharply with the bold, impulsive strategies of neighboring nobles. While other lords relied on cavalry charges, feasts to impress allies, or displays of ostentatious wealth, William focused on careful assessment, slow deliberation, and the subtle art of influence. His life, though seemingly unremarkable in outward drama, reveals the ways in which meticulous attention to detail could shape the stability and prosperity of a medieval domain. The Earl's palace, constructed on the edge of a river bend, reflected his methodical mindset. Hallways were long and straight, rooms were arranged for efficiency, and the gardens were designed to monitor both growth and movement. Paths were measured and maintained with precision, allowing the Earl to track the progress of gardeners, labourers, and visiting officials. Every corner of the estate carried a sense of order, and the layout itself communicated an implicit message that careful observation and deliberate action were valued above all else. William's daily routine was rigid yet purposeful. He rose with the sun, walking along the riverbank to observe both his land and the people who worked it. He carried a small journal, noting patterns in the weather, the behavior of livestock, and the progress of construction projects. Each observation was recorded meticulously, with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. For the Earl, these small insights provided the foundation for larger decisions regarding taxation, land allocation, and the management of serfs and tenants. The ordinary minutiae of life, such as the condition of soil, the direction of wind, or the behavior of a stream, were as important as reports from council meetings or imperial edicts. Council sessions reflected the same deliberative style. William's advisors would present matters in detail, and he would often remain silent for extended periods, absorbing information, comparing it with prior knowledge, and considering potential consequences. Decisions were rarely made immediately, and when they were measured and precise. This approach earned both admiration and frustration. Allies recognized the careful thought behind each ruling, while rivals interpreted the pauses as hesitation or weakness. Yet William understood that measured patience allowed him to respond with clarity and authority, rather than impulsiveness. One distinguishing feature of the Earl's court was the practice of daily observation walks. These excursions were not mere leisure, they were structured investigations. William would move slowly through the gardens, along the riverbanks, and through the surrounding forest, observing labourers, merchants, and travellers. He noted the reliability of workers, the honesty of merchants, and the subtle dynamics among tenants. These walks served multiple purposes: maintaining a connection with the land, reinforcing authority, and gathering first-hand information that could not be captured in written reports. The Earl's attention to detail extended to communication. Messages sent to neighbouring lords or distant merchants were carefully phrased, with attention to nuance and implication. Letters were drafted, revised, and sometimes delayed until William had assessed the proper timing. His understanding of timing as a tool of governance allowed him to exert influence without overt displays of force. By responding at precisely the right moment, he could sway negotiations, preempt conflicts, and assert authority with subtlety that often went unnoticed by casual observers. Despite his meticulous methods, challenges arose regularly. Southwestern England, though not embroiled in constant warfare, was a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions, minor feuds, and competing claims to land and resources. Some neighbouring nobles attempted to assert control over minor tolls, grazing rights, or forested areas, testing William's patience and precision. His responses were slow but deliberate. By documenting each claim, observing the parties involved, and timing his interventions, he often resolved disputes before they escalated, maintaining both stability and the perception of impartiality. The Earl's personal habits further reinforced his methodical approach. He maintained a modest study filled with ledgers, maps, and journals. He used carefully calibrated scales to measure supplies, documented livestock numbers weekly, and even tracked patterns of trade along local routes. These practices, while seemingly mundane, cultivated an environment in which precision and accountability became norms. Courtiers and officials quickly learned that every detail mattered, and their own behavior adjusted to meet the high standards of observation and order. Yet for all the apparent stability of William's rule, there were uncertainties. Weather could change suddenly, affecting crops and trade. Distant nobles could act unpredictably, and imperial mandates could arrive demanding immediate compliance with unfamiliar regulations. Even with meticulous observation and deliberate planning, the Earl recognized that some elements of governance remained beyond control. The interplay between measured preparation and unforeseen events would define both his successes and the potential vulnerabilities of his approach. The first months of his rule in this particular year brought a subtle but telling test. Reports arrived of small disturbances in villages near the forest edge. Minor disputes over water rights, grazing land, and tolls hinted at emerging tensions that, if left unchecked, could ripple through the region. William responded by increasing observation, sending trusted agents to gather information, and adjusting his patrols and inspections accordingly. He did not act hastily, yet each step was calculated to reinforce authority, prevent escalation, and maintain stability without provoking confrontation. As the days passed, it became evident that William's methodical patience was more than a personal preference. It was a strategic tool. While others might respond to minor disputes with immediate forceful action, he relied on observation, documentation, and timing. By waiting for the complete picture to emerge, he could intervene with authority that was informed, precise, and often more effective than a reactive approach. And yet, beneath the calm surface, a question lingered. Could the Earl's reliance on observation, patience, and precise timing withstand the unpredictable currents of politics, economics, and human ambition? Would the deliberate methods of a ruler who measured every step be sufficient to protect his domain, or might a single unforeseen event upset the balance he had cultivated so carefully? As spring turned to summer, Earl William's careful observation began to reveal patterns that were both reassuring and concerning. The minor disturbances along the forest edge were not isolated incidents. They were indicative of broader social and economic currents that could influence the stability of Blackwood. Farmers quarreled over water access, merchants debated tolls along trade routes, and a handful of ambitious neighboring nobles appeared to be testing the boundaries of their influence. For a ruler like William, whose methods depended on patience and precision, these developments required heightened attention. The Earl responded with the same methodical approach that had defined his rule. He increased the frequency of his observation walks, moving slowly along forest paths, riverbanks, and the main thoroughfares connecting villages. Each encounter with laborers, merchants, and local officials provided additional insight. A slight hesitation in speech, the careful measurement of goods, or the subtle rearrangement of a village path could reveal intentions or conflicts that were otherwise invisible in official reports. William recorded these details meticulously in his journal, building a comprehensive understanding of the social and economic landscape. One particular challenge arose from the behavior of a neighboring baron, who sought to extend control over a minor bridge used by local merchants. The baron's actions were subtle. He sent letters asserting rights, encouraged certain merchants to bypass the bridge, and tested local officials' loyalty through small bribes. To an impulsive ruler, these moves might have demanded immediate retaliation. William, however, responded with observation, rather than confrontation. He allowed the situation to unfold, gathering evidence, assessing the motivations of all parties, and noting patterns that could be addressed strategically. Within the palace, life continued according to familiar rhythms. William's chambers were filled with the gentle aromas of dried herbs and fresh flowers, creating a calm environment that facilitated reflection. Courtiers and scribes maintained the disciplined pace established by the Earl, and the deliberate cadence of council meetings reinforced the perception of order. In this controlled environment, decisions could be contemplated fully, enabling the Earl to act with clarity and authority when circumstances required intervention. Communication played a critical role in maintaining stability. Messages to the baron and local officials were carefully drafted, with precise wording that asserted authority, without provoking open conflict. William understood that timing and phrasing were as important as action itself. By delivering his responses, after careful consideration, he preserved the perception of patience while subtly signaling that he was fully aware of the Baron's maneuvers and would act if necessary. As summer progressed, the Earl's patience paid off. The Baron's attempts to influence local officials were documented and countered through subtle appointments and reassurances, reinforcing loyalty and deterring further manipulation. The minor disputes among farmers and merchants were also addressed incrementally, often through quiet negotiation rather than formal intervention. By acting at the right moments and relying on observation, William maintained control without the need for visible displays of force. Yet even as these successes unfolded, the Earl recognized that patience alone could not address all challenges. Seasonal changes brought unpredictable weather, affecting crops, trade and transport. Messages from the Emperor's court arrived with instructions that required prompt compliance, leaving little room for the extended deliberation William typically preferred. Additionally, the ambitions of neighboring lords could escalate rapidly if misjudged. Each day demanded a balance between observation, timing, and decisive action. The Earl's strategies extended beyond politics and trade into the realm of human behavior. He continued to listen carefully during council meetings, private audiences and casual encounters. By attending to tone, gesture and hesitation, he discerned loyalties, intentions and potential conflicts. These insights, gathered over months of meticulous observation, informed both his immediate decisions and his long-term strategy. William's awareness of subtle social cues became a tool as powerful as any army or fortress, allowing him to anticipate challenges and neutralize them before they escalated. Nevertheless, uncertainties persisted. The forested borderlands remained a site of potential conflict. Trade routes could be disrupted by external factors, and distant nobles might act in ways that were impossible to predict. While William's careful observation and deliberate action had maintained stability thus far, the future remained uncertain. The delicate equilibrium he had cultivated required continuous attention, and the slightest oversight could allow unforeseen consequences to unfold. As midsummer approached, a series of small but revealing events occurred. A merchant's delayed shipment highlighted vulnerabilities in trade routes. A minor land dispute among villagers suggested shifting alliances, and a traveling noble hinted at broader political movements in neighboring regions. Each event, seemingly trivial in isolation, provided pieces of a complex puzzle that William worked to interpret. The Earl's skill lay in connecting these fragments into a coherent picture, allowing him to act in ways that balanced authority, fairness, and strategic foresight. And so, as this second section of the story closes, you are left with a lingering question that mirrors the Earl's own careful contemplation. Can the methodical observation and deliberate timing that have guided William so far continue to protect his duchy in the face of unpredictable forces, or might the slow pace of measured action eventually falter against the swift currents of ambition, commerce, and circumstance? As midsummer yielded to autumn, Earl William's measured approach reached a decisive phase. The subtle tensions along the forest edge, the minor manipulations of neighboring nobles, and the economic fluctuations that had tested his patience, now converged into a challenge that required careful but resolute action. William's months of observation, documentation, and reflection provided him with a clear understanding of both his own strengths and the vulnerabilities of those around him, allowing him to act with precision that others might have mistaken for effortless authority. The coalition of nobles seeking influence over trade routes had, over time, revealed both their strategies and their limitations. William, having monitored every petition, movement, and report, now intervened in a manner that was deliberate yet unmistakably authoritative. He reinforced toll rights along the disputed bridges, reasserted official appointments, and subtly reshuffled positions of responsibility among local officials to reward loyalty and deter future manipulation. The intervention was executed without violence or public confrontation, yet it effectively neutralized the ambitions of his rivals and stabilized commerce across the region. Within the palace, life continued in its calm, structured rhythm. The gentle fragrance of dried herbs and flowers still filled the chambers and hallways, supporting reflection and concentration. Courtiers, scribes, and advisors maintained the disciplined pace that had become customary, allowing William to process reports, evaluate situations, and act with precision. These small environmental details, while seemingly minor, reinforced the Earl's presence and authority, subtly influencing the behavior and decision-making of all who entered his domain. William also continued his attentive practices with respect to the people under his rule. He met with villagers, merchants, and minor officials, listening to concerns with patience and noting even the smallest details. Hesitation, inflection, or a fleeting expression could reveal insights about intentions or loyalties. Through these careful observations, The Earl reinforced trust, resolved disputes quietly, and ensured that the flow of information within the duchy remained reliable. This approach not only stabilized governance, but also cultivated a sense of fairness and understanding among subjects who might otherwise have felt neglected or unheard. The autumn harvest brought additional pressures. Weather variations affected crops, while merchants and local officials contended with logistical challenges. William's precise monitoring allowed him to anticipate and address potential problems before they escalated. By adjusting schedules, reassigning resources, and maintaining constant observation, he mitigated the impact of environmental fluctuations on both commerce and social order. His methods, though slow and deliberate, proved remarkably resilient in the face of unpredictable challenges. Despite the successes, the Earl remained aware of the limitations of his approach. External forces beyond his observation, such as imperial mandates, sudden conflicts in neighboring regions, or the ambitions of particularly audacious nobles, could still threaten the stability he had cultivated. William's triumphs were not the result of brute force or dramatic conquest, but of the careful, patient application of strategy, timing, and understanding. The sustainability of this approach depended on vigilance, adaptability, and the continuous cultivation of both internal and external perception. By the end of the year, the results were evident. Trade remained steady, local disputes were minimized, and the influence of external nobles was contained without public confrontation. The duchy thrived under a governance style that valued observation, deliberation, and precision over spectacle or aggression. Villagers, merchants, and officials alike recognized the subtle authority of the Earl, understanding that his quiet patience carried both power and reliability. The measured steps of a single ruler had preserved stability in a complex and unpredictable environment. Yet even in this apparent triumph, the story leaves a lingering reflection. William's methods were effective precisely because of their careful calibration, but the world beyond Blackwood remained dynamic and unpredictable. Patience, observation, and timing could only carry so far in the face of sudden ambition, natural disaster, or political upheaval. Leadership, in the Earl's experience, required constant awareness of both human and environmental factors, and the capacity to act decisively when circumstances demanded. As the story of Earl William concludes, you are left with a quiet, thought-provoking question. Can the patient, measured strategies that guided his life continue to protect those who follow in his footsteps, or is there a moment when even the most deliberate and attentive methods must yield to the forces of unpredictability that shape history itself?